Hello everyone, I am Tacit, and today we are going to be going over a class tier list for all 36 classes within Gems of War. We've covered quite a few tier lists in the past, though not too many pretty recently. I even meant to cover this a couple months back, never got around to it, though we're finally getting around to it now. I figured today would be the perfect time to finally do this, as it is a class trial event right now for the Elementalist class. And as many of you know, Elementalist class is essentially the strongest class within the game. So we're going to be going from strongest to weakest, as you can see down there. We're basically going to start all the way from S tier and work our way down, starting with the better options and working down to the classes that are pretty much almost never used. As far as hero classes in general in Gems of War, you pretty much always want to be using one onto your team. They essentially have 10 traits due to their extra perks that they end up having. Whenever you end up getting them upgraded, they get essentially 7 whole extra traits, as you can see here, and this makes them very diverse compared to a normal unit, as you can use any hero weapon in them, as well as having essentially 10 traits instead of 3, making them near required on most teams, though there are still a few niche ones that run completely without one. But anyways, let's start all the way from the top, and instead of alphabetical order or anything, we will be going from absolute highest, strongest hero class into the absolute weakest. Do keep in mind, these are all my opinion, though feel free to mention your own in the comment section. This video obviously is also going to take quite a while as well, as you can probably see by the length already, as we're going to be going over all 36 classes. We're not going to be doing any teams or anything like that. This is mostly just to show like the exact mechanics, what each one is supposed to do. We might cover a separate video into the future going over teams. However, this particular video does not have teams, just explanations on all 36 of the hero classes. So let's start from the top and get into the Elementalist there then. So, Elementalist, where to even start with this thing? Probably the final trait. So, this thing stuns, and freezes, and burns, and entangles a random enemy whenever you take an extra turn off the board. All those are ends, not ors, meaning it is doing 4 stats effects per every single extra turn, making it better than almost anything in the entire game from an extra turn perspective. The main thing that's really devastating on it too is that it has stun as one of those 4 options, which means even if something just has a solo immune to freeze, burn, or entangle, well, it's just going to stun on top of it. And even if they have impervious, which would you normally stop all of these, you can end up having a curse on your team, and you're normally going to, because Elementalist hero class is, guess what, an elemental. So you can use Mirage Queen, which gives 50% mana start to all elementals, which you're probably using on a pure elemental team to begin with, but then you're also, especially since this class has one downside, it does not naturally have a half mana start, unfortunately, which is really important for most classes, but you're normally using it with Mirage Queen, so it doesn't matter. But anyways, you have him already on your team for the 4 times curse, so you're just going to be able to already apply all these, even if they have impervious. You're going to stun them, freeze them, burn them, entangle. You don't have to worry about any of that. So that is absolutely devastating. Getting a few extra turns basically just completely cripples the enemy team, and is very strong if you can get an early lead. On top of that, it is built very tanky. It has a freeze at the start of battle, which is insanely good. Sometimes it runs to stun instead, though almost always you're running with freeze, particularly in PvP-like situations. Has immune to freeze itself, so it could be combined with immune to stun and freeze that it has. It has immune to stun on its final trait there, but it gets to have that combination. So unless you're like curse stunning it, it's going to be able to have both those two immunities. So very, very strong. The third one, unfortunately, doesn't really have too much of a good option. You normally either run extra magic to yellows, or you run it with some extra bulk to your browns, which you're generally going to have due to running Brown Storm into Barrier on Brown. So on the next one, you're almost always running Brown Storm because you need them for Barrier on Browns. Obviously, any Barrier on Brown hero class is extremely bulky. It does have to come with Submerge, though you're generally not running Submerge. You're almost always going for Barrier. There are some rare niche situations where you might want Submerge for your team. The next one is pretty flexible depending on what you want. Either Explode, single gem, extra mana for blue, extra mana for brown, really depends how you want to build it. And of course, you pretty much always run into Fortitude for a bunch of immunities. However, it does have the alternative if you're building a really all-out offensive team. Since it is going to be used with elementals, you can give it additional magic off of elementals. If there's any class to use it, this is among one of them that you would end up doing so, as it's pretty much primarily going to be used in pure elemental team, being able to benefit from it itself while also being an elemental. So long story short, it is an insanely good hero class. Highly advise using if you haven't already been doing so. And hey, we got a class event for today if you're watching it to the day that this tier list is going out. So great time to go upgrade it, though even if it's not, you can easily go and upgrade it manually. So next we have Archmagus coming up here. So Archmagus, I do have a second. You might notice there's actually no Titan up in final tier. The main reason for that, I would actually say, is more so the final one that we're going to be going to in S tier there. That a lot of you might not even know what it does. It might be a little bit spoiler territory, but if it's anything like Elementalist, it came out pretty much just as is in the spoiler thing. Anyways, I'm moving to Titan. I'm moving to Art Titan. I meant Archmagus. I was mentioning Titan. Anyway, so as far as Archmages are concerned, the most main gimmick that makes this thing good is it is essentially the best caster in the game. It has a 50% mana start. Like, its main gimmick is that it has a 50% mana start into having a billion purple mana. So it has +2 purple off of its final trait, which in itself is already insanely good, but it also gains additional purple off of its second to last one, having a total of +3 purple. There's only one other hero class in the entire game that has this, and it's Corsair. However, the reason why Corsair isn't as far up is it doesn't have a natural 50% mana start, whereas this thing does. One other benefit that this thing ends up getting is it has Arcane. So every single time anything casts a spell, including itself, including any ally, it will end up gaining 1 additional magic. And this might not seem like much, especially later in the game, but it does definitely add up, especially if you're using a weapon that hits all enemies, which generally if you're using this class, you are, like with one that scythes or Black Manacle or, you know, anything that's a purple weapon hitting 4 enemies. You're normally going down that route unless you're using like more of a support thing in order to feed something else purple mana. However, it's really good at getting you a lot of mana, and you're kind of just building up with extra damage. You're likely getting at least 4 extra damage per extra magic that you're getting per cast. So you can end up bulking up a lot of extra damage there. As far as its perks, it does have quite a few useless ones. The first one here is generally ran either into extra armor for purples, because you're going to have some amount of purples on your team, obviously generally at least 2, because you're going to need something extra to have your purple mana bleed into. Though occasionally you run with the Super Chaotic Storm. Then, given that you're taking so many purples, you generally go for that little bit of lifesteal. Doesn't do much, but as long as you don't have a perk that triggers off it, you can end up accumulating a bit of HP across the battle. You get a little bit of spell reduction, which isn't much, but better than nothing. Has the 50% mana start, which is crucial for its viability. Next one really depends if you're running a relic weapon or not. Otherwise, you could go for a Doomstorm, or you could even just have no perk at all if you don't want to end up running the Doomstorm, because sometimes you won't be able to use a relic. Giant's bonus will generally do nothing on many teams that it gets used on, and sometimes you don't actually want to Doomstorm at start of battle, and it is possible in hero classes to set to nothing. So for example, if we actually wanted to set for nothing, for any of you that don't know, let's say for example this team right now, we wanted to have an Archmagus on, which obviously we wouldn't, there's not a single purple on that team, but let's say we did, and we set to Archmagus. One thing that we can actually do is go into the code thing, and we can end up setting the value to 0. So if we go into global right here, and go set it to, what was it, the 4th value if I'm not mistaken? So we can end up setting the 4th value to 0, copying this, make sure it's on our copy, and then just go put it straight into our thing. And as you can see here, we now have nothing. So instead of having a Doomstorm there, we can end up having a absolutely nothing there instead. Did I just put on the wrong one? I did. Oh, whoops, that's not the one I wanted. But you can end up doing it to the correct value this time. And set the other one back to, whatever we had it on. And then go copy this one. And then we can have the correct value on the thing. Actually, we got to put it over top of our team here. And as you can see here, now we should have it on the right value. So you can actually end up setting it to absolute... Wait, did I do the wrong one again? No, I did the right one. I was going to say. But yeah, you can end up doing that in order to set it to nothing if you truly want to. So as you can see now we have it set to nothing if you so want to for whatever reason. Though generally, if you wanted nothing, you would just go for the giant trait anyways, which would effectively do nothing to begin with. But that is an option. So if you ever do want to turn them off, you can't do that for troops, you can't do that for weapons, but you can do it for hero classes, oddly enough. So a nice interesting feature there if you didn't know about it. But anyways, that's pretty much the whole gimmick. It just gets a lot of purple mana. Does have that elemental thing as well, which sometimes it's used with elemental or 2. Sometimes you go to mystic bonus depending on what your team is. But generally, you're going to get a lot more value from the elemental bonus, even though it doesn't tend to get used with as many elementals as something like Elementalist, obviously. However, Elemental's still very meta, a lot of really good ones out there, so still gets the synergy there. Anyways, next on our list, we end up having the Thief hero class. This is primarily a Guild War hero class, so there are some instances outside of Guild War where you might end up incorporating it. However, it is arguably the strongest stealthy hero class class in the game. Pretty much every single class has a main gimmick, and that's pretty much this thing's main gimmick. It has a natural 50% mana start, gets some damage poke on last slot, but it's mostly viable for how it ends up using its stealthy. So stealthy, very strong ability, makes it so the hero can't be targeted, or anything that's stealthy can't be targeted unless the rest of your team remains as stealthy. However, the main gimmick that ends up making this so good is how many ways it has to summon. It actually has 3 ways to summon. This build right here is the max amount of summon build. It has a 20% chance to summon a Sister of Shadows when an enemy dies. It has a 35% chance that anything that dies on your team becomes a bandit, and that includes the bandit itself. So when your bandit dies, there's a 35% chance that bandit will become a bandit, and then that bandit will become a bandit's bandit, and then that bandit will become a bandit, and then it just keeps chaining forever. It used to be 50%, so at 35% it is still insanely high. And on top of that, it also has a 25% chance to summon a Hierophant, or Heroine, I mean, when anything on your team casts a spell, and that's literally anything on your team. So similar to Arcane on that other class where you're getting 1 magic per cast, this thing's a 25% chance, so after like 4 casts, you're pretty much getting a Heroine. It's not guaranteed, but pretty likely. Sometimes you run with dodge though. It really depends on where you're using it on your team and what your goal is for the hero class. But sometimes 30% scroll dodge will be more viable than running it with the extra summon, because it already has other summons to begin with. But if you really want to go all in summon build to be ultra annoying, you can end up going for that. So that's pretty much its main gimmick. Has some Hunter's Mark in order to pressure with. Its a second perk pretty much does nothing in most situations, though sometimes you can get some extra damage for your weapon. It's normally actually ran with dagger, but there are some missiles that are good. The reason I say dagger is it's actually the like weapon type for the thing. There's a few that you can kind of do it with, like skeleton key, stuff like that. Ruptor, if not mistaken, is dagger. So there's like a few that you can get some decent value off of. We already went over to summon, stealthy, summon, and pretty funny final trait. There's a few hero classes that have this, of course, as you would expect from any of these tiers. However, this is a pretty RNG mechanic that very rarely will do something in a battle, but when it does, it kind of just auto wins. So this is a 7% chance to assassinate the last enemy when another enemy dies. Similar to Bandit, this can chain. So what can end up happening is you get a kill. That 7% chance then kills a enemy. That killed enemy from the 7% chance then has a 7% chance that it will get another kill. So it is possible to get a kill, then that 7% kills an enemy, and then that 7% from that 70% kills an enemy. And then if you get super lucky, that 77% from that 7% will then kill off of another 7% the final troop, meaning in one kill you just killed 4 units. Obviously the chance of that happening is near impossible, but it theoretically could. Realistically, you're looking for just, get a kill and then another thing kills. But sometimes you'll get a triple kill, and occasionally you'll just auto win the battle, assuming the enemy team has nothing that can has immune to insta kill. So yeah, it's pretty funny. But whenever you even get a single insta kill off this, you're basically getting 2 for the price of 1. Is extremely devastating, and will pretty much lead to an auto win situation. This is built mostly for stalling. It's built into like use a second, third slot kind of option, have a billion summons on it, kind of just whittle down the enemy slowly over time, which is why it's mostly used on Guild War Defend, though it is a pretty devastating thing to be using offensively. And if you're looking for an offensive stealthy hero class, it's generally the best way to go. And it's normally ran with dodge if you're using it offensively, which is why I had it on dodge earlier, as you generally don't need that much summon if you're offensively using it, as you're generally not going to be losing as much compared to an AI team. So you can use the dodge to make sure that a bunch of skull spam doesn't end up catching you off guard. Okay, so next we have ourselves the hero class of the Slayer. So Slayer, you probably see me using it a lot in Explore 12. This is a hero class I definitely underestimated a little bit when it first came out. However, the main gimmick that it has is as yet another triple damage burning hero class. This is oddly enough the first triple damage burning that we're going over, and the main reason for that is it's so good compared to every other triple damage burning. There are a few that are somewhat decent too, like Sunspear and stuff. However, this thing's main gimmick is actually its second trait here. It becomes enraged when an enemy dies. This might seem redundant, as there's already many hero classes that have something similar, including itself, which is become enraged when taking an extra turn. However, the main reason why this other trait is so much more broken is when an enemy dies, you'll get enraged, which means every single time that you get a kill off of an enraged skull, you're still going to be enraged afterwards, meaning once you have enraged, you basically perpetually have enraged for the rest of battle. The main synergy that this has that is exceedingly broken is with Zugoff. Zugoff gets you a kill, which triggers your enrage, and then you get kills from that because it creates skulls. You're getting triple damage burning off of that because not only does Zugoff also burn, but you're also getting the skulls into it, And yeah, it's really crazy. Aside from that, it gets to inflict bleed on all enemies when an enemy dies, so it has a way to bleed poke. One thing that's actually pretty noteworthy about this, it's a good way to remove barrier. The bleed will trigger onto everything, all enemies. So once you actually get a kill, they're not really going to be able to barrier spam after that, so you just constantly keep getting the barrier off every single time, which is pretty convenient. It gets a little bit extra base attack, which over time becomes increasingly worse, but hey, a little bit extra attack on something that already has a billion attack, kind of nice. When an enemy dies, you get a freeze, so basically this hero class, once you get a single kill, you pretty much just like wipe out the rest of the team. It might be a little bit hard for the team to get the initial kill, but once it does, it's in a pretty good position. Next, all three of these generally aren't really that worth using. Burning a random enemy when an ally dies is probably the strongest one from an offensive standpoint, but you generally just use it for the souls, for some free souls, as many situations you're not going to get any value from this whatsoever, and you might as well just get some free souls while using it. Next, you're generally going to go into Firestorm in order to end up getting the red mana that you need for your team. However, it does have option to Blue Storm for the niche situations that you might end up using it in. Aside from that, you're generally going to use gain 3 attack when an enemy dies, giving even more value when an enemy ends up dying. However, you can also end up going for stealing a bunch of life if you want it to be slightly bulkier in order to protect maybe against one more additional attack. You go for Enrage off an extra turn. While it does have, of course, 2 different other perks like extra mad mana or the Death Mark thing, the main reason why you tend to go for the Enrage is mostly because you sometimes need that initial Enrage in order to get your initial poke. If you happen to be using it in a context that isn't necessarily Zugoff, you can end up using that as well, just to kind of close the gap. It just is even more ways to ensure that you would just always maintain your Enrage perpetually. However, you can switch it out if you, depending on your team, and pretty much always you're going to be running triple damage burning, as is one of the main reasons to end up running it. So yeah, very strong class. Has a lot of really weird use cases too. Like it could even be ran in really low level areas, like when you run it with like a quick kill Dust Devil team, it can actually end up getting kills and then the bleed ends up wiping out the rest of the units. It's a really weird hero classes that has a lot of really niche use cases, but overall it makes it a very, very strong triple damage burning and arguably the strongest one in the entire game. So this next one is a bit of a weird one in that it doesn't currently exist. This next one I believe is called Geomancer, I think is its name. Well, anyways, I think I have it up right here. So right here, it is called the where on earth is its name? Yeah, the Geomancer. I was right. So this is the Geomancer. Main gimmick with this thing is it's not out yet. Supposedly it comes out on July 22nd. Today is July 7th, so not today. 14 days from now. Well, technically 15 days. 14 days and some amount of hours. But anyways, as far as this hero class is concerned, it is basically the new Titan hero class. Titan is still going to be viable, however, this thing is better Titan in most situations. So most noteworthy thing that you'll see immediately, of course, is that it has Stone Tree. This means it has Barrier on Brown. But if we look over at its other perks that it has over here, it is insanely bulky. So it has a 50% mana start, so any hero class with natural 50% mana start, always great to end up seeing. It does it specifically to constructs, which has some pretty interesting use cases. Of course, the Lord of Slaughter, probably one of the first things that come to mind, though there are a lot of support units, similar to Giant, that end up giving support to as mana accumulation. So it also has a 50% score reduction, making it the basically tankiest hero class in the game, depending on the context, because it has 50% score reduction. It has 20% spell reduction off of this, reduce magic damage from spells by 20%, and it ends up getting barrier on Brown off of the, wherever the thing is, the rock solid there. So basically, the way that you would generally end up running this then would end up likely being the impact, so that you stun whenever you get hit by a skull. You're then likely running the... Gosh, it's slightly hard to see when we're doing it this way. Let's see. The second one's going to generally be useless. The third perk is going to end up being your 20% spell reduction. Your fourth perk will end up being not rock solid. What is it on right there? You don't need 50% mana start because you're already getting off the other thing. So your fourth perk is likely going to be Tactician, so you can get that extra little bit of magic for an AoE weapon or whatever weapon you might be running. You're then going to run your fifth perk on rock solid for Barrier on Brown. Your 6 perk is pretty versatile as it's all mana accumulating related ones. You can either get extra mana on brown, extra mana on purple, or enchant on taking green. So depending on what your team is, you would end up doing it based on that. And of course, your final perk would end up being Fortitude for immune to stun and all the other immunes. So it's going to have immune to stun, poison, disease, death mark, lycanthropy, and devour, while having 50% scroll reduction, 20% spell reduction, a half mana start, and barrier on brown. So this thing is going to be insanely tanky while still being pretty versatile. You'll be able to use this for pretty much any kind of build you really want, just kind of as a general first slot, second slot tank, while still being able to mana accumulate decently, while having some interesting synergies with some constructs out there. So yeah, it's definitely going to be pretty viable and basically going to be the Titan replacement. There are still some niche instances where you're going to use Titan, as it has some other advantages like Enrage, obviously the fact that 50% mana starts giants, so if you're doing a pretty heavy giant or troll related team, you can end up doing it with that. However, this overall, from just a use case, like not counting what it gives 50% mana to, is probably going to be slightly stronger than Titan, which is already such a good, well-versed hero class. So really looking forward to this in a couple weeks. But yeah, it's probably going to be S tier when it comes out, though. We'll have to know for sure once it ends up actually coming around. Anyways, let's go bring up the tier list and quite literally bring it up as we're going into A tier. And guess what's the first thing there? I almost felt like still putting in S. However, I did put it all the way at the top of A, though it could still very easily still be considered S tier, and that is good old Titan. So Titan hero class, probably just overall one of the most well-rounded hero classes in the entire game. Main gimmick it has is it gives all giants 50% mana start, has many of the same benefits as the hero class we just went over. It has barrier on brown. One really nice thing that it has is Enrage into barrier on brown, so not only is it very defensive but also skull offensive. With a natural mana start, it basically covers all your bases. So it has really high skull damage that hits through traits. It has really high protection because it constantly keeps gaining barrier while having a bunch of immunities, and it also has really good mana start by having a half mana start while also having storm that goes into its color. You could even go even heavier into mana by going into explode into the final trait there, and yeah, just really versatile. It's one of the only things in the entire game where it can use almost every single thing under every single one of its trees, depending on the circumstance, though there are a few that it tends to go into. So its first trait almost always goes into extra skull damage or stun when it ends up getting poked. There are some very niche instances where you might run the Chaos Storm, but very rarely. Next, you'll almost always go into the extra damage for counterattack, though depending on if you're using a hammer or mace that you might want extra magic for, you can go down that route, otherwise you're going into extra attack. Next one, you're pretty much going into either extra magic for yellow allies or extra armor for brown. You're generally using with a lot of brown, so normally go down the armor route. Next one is almost always going to be used for Brown Storm, mostly because it's synergizing the rest of everything else that it does. Its main gimmick is barrier on brown, so you definitely want to do that, especially because it has Brown Storm into barrier on brown, which is a very, very strong combination. It has Enrage. However, depending on what kind of team you want to use it with, you can go for the extra brown mana or the explode on yellow, generally the bloodthirsty or the explode whenever you take an extra turn onto a random yellow gem. And of course, it almost always runs with all of its immunities. However, it is yet another one that has the elemental bonus. So depending on if you're running a bunch of giant elementals or more slightly heavier elemental team, you will sometimes end up running this instead of its immunities. However, you're generally going to go down the immunities for the bulk. And yeah, just a nice little thunderbolt pattern. Pretty much a generic way to end up running Titan, but there are a few kind of switch outs you can end up doing depending on if you want it to be more mana heavy or more skull heavy. Really depends on how you want to build it, but definitely still one of the most diverse hero classes in the entire game due to the wide range they can end up covering. It's the hero class that isn't the absolute best at any one given thing, but does absolutely everything at a really competent degree, which is why it's all the way at the top of A, though you could easily consider it S. It really just depends. Just as we get more and more focused hero classes, I do feel like Titan over time, since Elementalist and a new one that we're getting in a couple weeks, it keeps getting like increasingly worse, especially as we keep getting all these barrier on brown hero classes that are generally more niche, but they're stronger when they can be used. And given that there's 36 hero classes, you generally want hero classes that are really good at a specific thing, whereas Titan's just kind of good at everything. It's definitely a hero class I would advise as like your very first hero class to start upgrading, as it's so versatile and you can use it theoretically as your own hero class. But the biggest issue as we keep getting more and more hero classes, each single individual hero class excels at something, which technically makes Titan worse, as it's just decently good at everything. Anyways, so let's go into our next one here, which is Orbweaver, which is probably the most frightening thing ever in Guild Wars, and it's pretty much the only context it's used in, which otherwise it would be higher. However, it is, like, unlike Thief, which can be used pretty viably outside of Guild Wars, this one's almost entirely only used in Guild Wars, but is so devastating in Guild Wars, we can't not mention it in a pretty high tier. So, as far as this thing, the main gimmick that it has is it has a 35% chance to summon a giant spider when I take damage. This includes any damage, including 1 damage. It could take literally 1 HP damage randomly to, like, poison, bleed, something else, and it will end up summoning a giant spider 35% of the time. This is extremely devastating, as it is generally used with a purple weapon, and giant spider creates a bunch of purple mana that will end up feeding over to it. It also constantly keeps building up a tank that doesn't have stealthy, while the hero class itself also has stealthy. Not sure if I really mentioned that during Thief, but that's kind of the main reason why all the summons were pretty strong, is you can constantly keep summoning something that doesn't have stealthy, so that they have to keep targeting that instead. So very, very strong in that degree. Also, a while back, you were actually able to get a non-stealthy bandit. However, if your bandit does have stealthy, one nice thing about Orbweaver is you don't need to worry about that, because giant spider will never have stealthy, so you'll be able to have a nice tank that they can always end up having to target due to the stealthy that you have. Anyways, it has mana shield as well, gives it immune to mana drain, a few other things, but mana drain is the only relevant thing there. As far as its perks, you can either run it with 5 extra attack in PvP, which generally is always used in PvP because it's either used offensively or defensively in a PvP-like mode. It has, but generally you end up going for web a random enemy when I summon a troop. You're generally summoning a lot of things with this. You're normally using in second or third slot, more often not second, and you're constantly summoning things into the first slot just to end up dying. So you're going to be able to get a lot of webs just slowly over the enemy. Next one you kind of run based on if you need extra magic to bow or extra jewelry. Generally it's doing it to neither because it's normally running with a tome. Unfortunately, none of those say tome. Ends up entangling first enemy, which can be pretty devastating if they don't have any way to deal with it, as they won't be able to skull pressure you for a couple turns. So that's pretty nice. Next you have basically your choice of Green Storm or Purple Storm, though it's normally ran with Purple Storm. Next you have Stealthy, which you should always 100% of the time be ran with, as it is pretty useless without it. Next you end up running with, gosh, all these are actually kind of bad. You normally run with, there's normally a lot of elves on your team whenever you run this, so you tend to run the extra bit of magic and attack to elves. It doesn't make too huge a difference, but every little bit helps. And it is one of those really annoying ones that if you get lucky, you'll have that 7% insta-kill, as I was mentioning earlier. Really strong. Normally it does nothing in a given battle. However, if it does anything in any battle, you basically auto-win. So it has that going for it, which is pretty nice. However, like 99% of the reason you're using this, probably 90%, is this trait right here. Like literally its final trait. It's just so annoying with it. It constantly keeps getting summons. It's stealthy, makes it so you have to target it, and just makes it really, really bulky, especially when combined with a bulky weapon. Normally it's used with life and death, which just gives it a bunch of life, gives it death mark. It's a very slow win option, which is why it's normally on defend. However, it's really good at just fatiguing out the enemy and getting value over time over top the enemy and just winning that way, by kind of just like a slow fatigue. Anyways, next we have the Sunspear hero class, which is also arguably the best triple damage burning. I do personally feel like Slayer in the current state of the game is a bit better. However, Sunspear is still really, really good. So main gimmick with Sunspear, and the main reason why you're generally going to be using it on your team, is it is a triple damage burning that has Perpetual Firestorm. It is the only way currently within the game to have Perpetual Firestorm. They didn't add another one, right? I'm pretty sure it's the only one. If it's not the only one, there's one other thing, but I'm pretty sure it's the only thing. But anyways, it has Perpetual Firestorm. This in itself is insane. Actually, I think they did add one thing that has it, which is why my brain's like, wait, is there one? But yeah, I think there's like one other thing, though. You're generally going to be using hero for it because the hero is just going to be overall better, unless you really need a weird hero with it. But anyways, it has Perpetual Firestorm. This into triple damage burning is like literally the whole reason why I use it. One other thing that's actually kind of good, which I believe one other hero class has, though it might be the only one. I actually can't remember off the top of my head. We'll find out when we get there. However, it actually has freeze into entangle. This is a extremely strong combination, as you're basically getting a lot of turn 1 value, and if the enemy has no Orpheus metal, no way to cleanse or anything like that, this is going to give you a very huge lead right at the start of battle. It's going to entangle the first enemy so they can't do anything with skulls, and it's going to throw down the random freeze so they can't just infinite loop on you, which gives you a very strong start already immediately without even needing to do anything. Also, you already perpetually have the storm in your favor, so if they're a team that needs a specific storm, you also counter the storm. So you're getting a freeze at start, you're getting a tangle at start, and you're setting the storm at start, making sure that they can't counter you out. So very strong in that regard. Has immune to freeze, which is always good to see. Third perk generally is just going to always be giving allies a bunch of life, as Green Storm is pretty pointless, as I believe the this only works for turn 1 if I'm not mistaken, as I believe it goes in an order where the Firestorm actually triggers first. So unless for whatever reason you desperately needed a Green Storm for only turn 1, I guess you could maybe run it. Otherwise, yeah, you're pretty much always going to run that extra blue. And its trait's completely redundant and does absolutely nothing because it already has Firestorm perpetually. Next, you would either go for Submerge if you wanted it for the bulk, or the extra magic to red allies, which generally the way that it goes because it's random with so many reds due to Perpetual Red Storm. There are some really niche instances where you might end up giving some armor to green allies, though that's very rare, and normally you're going for Submerge or extra magic. Next, you are generally going to toss up between either blue mana or red mana, but given that you have Perpetual Red Storm, you're pretty much always going to go into red mana regardless of how much you need it, as you're going to have at least 2 reds on your team, and it's almost always going to be the better option due to the storm being constantly set to it. And of course, you're always going to be setting into triple damage burning, as that's the main reason why you're even bringing it out, and just doing that with a triple damage burning team that happens to need a lot of red, which is good because a lot of things that have the burning capability are also red, coincidentally. So it ends up working out really nicely. So overall, great solid triple damage burning hero class. So next on our list, we end up having the Frostmage, which can kind of contest Archmagus as well for that kind of caster role. However, it's not as good necessarily as Archmagus, but serves many of the similar roles. So the main reason why you would use this is you want Archmagus with freeze. Basically, you want all the benefits that Archmagus has, but instead of having even more of a benefit into casting, you want to throw a little bit of freeze at the cost of some of your viability at casting, which is basically the main premise of this. The main reason you're using this is for its final trait ends up having a 25% chance to freeze a random enemy when an ally casts a spell. This might seem worse than having it on Elemental, where you just take a few extra turns, you just disable the entire enemy team. However, there are some niche instances where you can actually end up getting more overall freeze from this. However, the main reason why you do it is with this combined with its spell casting capability. Not only does it have Arcane similar to Archmagus, but it also has a natural 50% mana start while having just really good casting combined with its little bit of extra mana accumulation. It's not as good as a +3 into purple, however it does have +1 into blue, and also has flexibility into purple, so it's kind of like a slightly less casty Archmagus while just having extra freeze mechanic. So kind of an in-between where you trade it off for less damage but higher survivability by making sure the enemy cannot extra turn. So you end up getting a freeze to start a battle, which is pretty much the way it always ends up getting ran. Immune to freeze so you can't get countered by it, 20% spell reduction to make you a little bit bulkier, natural 50% mana start so you can just always be able to cast quickly. You're normally running Submerge so you can end up having a little bit extra bulk, as it's not the tankiest of hero classes, so that can give it something to kind of tank with. You can either go for extra blue or purple mana, but generally in the context that most teams are going for blue. You can also go for the Explode, but generally going into blue mana there. And you can end up giving Elementals a bunch of extra magic, which stacked with Arcane can end up stacking for quite a bit, because not only will you end up getting extra magic for yourself whenever you cast a spell, but you'll also be able to get it for Elemental allies whenever you cast a spell. So you'll be able to get a lot of extra magic across the team over time. So it's basically just a casting thing. Not as good as Archmagus, but it's basically weaker Archmagus, but with freeze is the easiest way to end up describing that. Anyways, next one we have here is the Bard, or not Bard, what's the thing's called again? Monk. Monk hero class. So as far as the Monk is concerned, main gimmick with this is its final trait here ends up having a gain 3 mana when matching 4 or more gems. One thing that's actually pretty good with is the AI, though you could use it for yourself of course too. This makes it so you can make the AI prioritize casting your hero weapon a bit more. Because if it's taking a bunch of extra turns, it's going to constantly be gaining extra mana directly to your hero, regardless of where your hero is. It's also a weird mechanic where you can kind of like block your hero, almost use it in 4th slot, even though you generally wouldn't with this hero class, but you could use it in like a 3rd, 4th slot kind of thing, like a backline hero tank, and have it mana accumulate back there, even if it's blocked on mana, because this mana accumulation will work even if you're fully blocked on every other mana. Has some skull dodge. It's not the best skull dodge hero class, but getting lucky on that can be pretty beneficial. Having that skull dodge in the barrier on Brown's also very devastating. It has a snap freeze, so you're generally going to be getting the freeze to start a battle, though you can go for stun depending on how you want to end up running it. You have the cleanse, which is actually really, really good too. Ends up cleansing whenever you end up taking a extra turn, which makes it particularly bulky when combined with a barrier on Brown, as it also has a way to get rid of any kind of annoying status effects on you. You don't even need the immune to freeze because you're just going to cleanse it off your extra turn anyways. You get some extra armor onto your Browns generally, though you can end up going for even more bulk by having recovery. You're generally going to go for Fairy Fire. Fairy Fire random enemy when an ally dies. You're generally even though it is a bulkier hero class, you're generally not using this in first slot. It's normally a second, third, or fourth, depending on what you're looking to do. So you're normally going to get at least one Fairy Fire, if not multiple, through this. So you can end up kind of getting a nice little kill at the end of a battle. You're running a Rock Solid generally because you're going to be taking a Barrier on Brown in order to keep tanking up. There are some rare situations because you're normally using this in later in your slot on your team, like normally a far back third kind of team. You can sometimes go Submerge because it's already so far back that it might not necessarily need the brown to Barrier on Brown to end up tanking with. So there are some situations where you actually run it with Submerge depending on the context of the team that you're up against. You have a choice of 3 different manas and depends entirely on your team if you go extra blue, brown, or green. Normally you're going to go brown, though there are some builds where you do go a different color depending on what you're trying to achieve with it. And of course, while it does have Cleanse, you normally want to make sure you have immune to stun, which this trait ends up doing, with a billion other immunes as well. And the main reason for this is your Cleanse will not work if you're stunned. All these 7 of these traits, not sure if I mentioned this yet, but all these traits will get disabled. Any of them that don't trigger at start of battle will get disabled when you're stunned. So having immune to stun is a ridiculously good trait to have, as all 10 of these traits that hero has that don't trigger at start of battle will have immune. So let's say you have like 10 constantly active traits. If you did not have immune to stun, all 10 of them would get disabled if you did not end up having this immune to stun. So it's a very, very strong perk that is viable on literally every single thing that ends up coming on. So really strong, and having that Cleanse with it basically helps keep it protected, making it among one of the bulkier hero classes in the game. You're normally using it if you want a hero class that is generally going to constantly stay with no stats effects, while also acting more as a support option for your team. So great third slot, great fourth slot kind of thing, which is kind of weird for Barrier on Brown kind of hero classes, as most of them are ran in first or second. This is more of a backline kind of one. There's another one that kind of does it similarly, a Plaguelord, when we get down to that. However, he's quite a bit worse at doing such a role comparatively. Anyways, last thing that I have here on A tier is the Sentinel hero class. So as far as Sentinel is concerned, Sentinel is an interesting one. If I can actually find it, where on earth is S? S, hello, Sentinel, Sentinel. There it is. Right, so as far as the Sentinel is concerned, main gimmick with this is it's pretty bulky, though not as bulky as the other hero class that we're going to be getting soon. But it has 25% chance to bury a random ally at the start of its turn. This is pretty inconsistent, but it has a lot of bulk, has that 40% score reduction. Ends up having a barrier at start of battle while also having barrier on Brown, which is rather unique and decently strong. However, probably one of the strongest things that it has is Dispel while having barrier on Brown. There is one other hero class, if I'm not mistaken, a Dwarven hero class, that has this exact combination. However, Sentinel does it better due to its other perks that it has. So it's generally the way you want to go if you're looking for a tank Dispel. There are a few hero classes that are decent with the Dispel, but Sentinel is among one of the strongest that you'll end up running, as it has a really high bulk while still having the capability to fully use it, and you don't even touch the morale tree normally. You're normally just going all in on the 2 really protective trees, end up stunning them whenever they take a skull on you. The third one is just extra magic for anything that you might be using, and then you go for barrier at start of battle. Just make sure you have the extra bulk right as soon as you start. You generally go for that 20% extra damage to your skulls, just for a little bit of skull pressure based on your armor. Even though it's in first slot and your armor's going to get hit, you can still end up pressuring some kind of damage. It's kind of like Tina 9000 in that regard, except only 20% instead of 50%. Barrier on Brown to make sure you live. Even though you already have barrier at start of battle, obviously you're going to want to make sure you keep perpetuating that throughout the rest of the battle. You can run a little bit of Brown mastery, though generally you're running with Dispel, because if you're running this class, you're basically running it because of Dispel. If you wanted Brown, you'd probably be using a stronger hero class for that. You'd likely be using a new Geomancer or Titan, or like literally any class but this one. If you're using this one, you're using it more so because it has Banish, which dispels all enemies' traits whenever you take, or not traits, all enemies' stats effects whenever you take an extra turn. So like Barrier, Enchant, Submerge, stuff like that. Any kind of positive stats effects they have, they will all lose all their positive stats effects, which can be pretty beneficial depending on the context of the battle. And of course, immune to stun and all that, as you would normally run on a class like this almost always, unless you're running a little bit more of an offensive build. Anyways, that brings us down to pretty much the entire usable tier. No, actually, technically B is kind of usable. S tier is like the stuff you're like almost constantly using. A tier is definitely the stuff you're using a lot. But you're using it for like more situational kind of situations. And next we're going to the beefiest tier, the one that absolutely has the most amount of things, as you can see as we scroll it up. That's why the bar right there is so wide. It is mostly because of this tier right here. So yeah, there's a lot here. This is like the last like super viable tier. We're starting to get into things so niche that you're very rarely going to use it, but still usable. They're kind of things that you're definitely not using it anywhere near as much as the first 11 there, or 10 depending on how you look at it. 10 that currently exists in the game, 11 if you count the one that doesn't exist yet. But yeah, SNA basically the top 10. Now we're starting to get into the very niche situations, but still there's still some pretty good stuff here. So we're starting here with the gosh, I forget its name, Stormcaller. So Stormcaller here. Stormcaller is mostly used for Perpetual Yellowstorm. If you're using this, you're using it for one of two reasons. You're building a Pure Strix team, or you're doing Perpetual Yellowstorm, or both simultaneously, as it tends to get used in, as it's used very commonly with triple finesse into this trait. Is actually, oddly enough, one of the strongest things, even though it's technically a common troop. So yeah, Perpetual Yellowstorm, main reason you're using this thing. As far as how you build it, you can build it into extra life or armor, though generally life is the better stat and doesn't use armor for anything, so you're normally using it to life. Or you can go the random Chaos Storm, but given that you have Perpetual Yellow, you're normally going down yellow. As cleanse, which is just great to have, just cleanse off any kind of negative status effects. It does not have immune to stun like the other hero class we just went over. So unlike Sentinel, it doesn't have the benefit of having immune to stun into cleanse. However, just simply having cleanse is still pretty good in certain situations. Obviously, anytime the enemy has a lot of freeze and stuff like that. But if it gets stunned, it will stop doing that mechanic. You're generally using it with a lot of yellow due to yellow Perpetual Yellow Storm, so you're going to use it with that extra magic there normally. You do have access to Fairy Fire when an ally dies, and normally this hero class is used pretty far down in your team, normally like 3rd and 4th slot, so you are going to get some value for it, similar to the other hero class, so you're going to get some Fairy Fires down and be able to clean up whatever's left. Next, you generally go for, due to how many yellows you're going to be using on your team, you normally just go for a little bit extra attack on yellow. Most of these perks are pretty bad, but you're generally almost using a pure yellow team whenever you're bringing it out, so it gets benefit there. There's going to be so many yellows on the board that there's going to be a lot of targets whenever you take an extra turn for the explode on yellow, so you'll be able to get value there. There's some really niche instances where you might take it for green mana, but you're normally going for the explosion on yellow. And the final thing is all Strix ends up gaining 1 extra attack whenever you end up every single turn that goes by, and generally that you're using this in pretty heavy yellow Strix related teams, you're going to be able to get benefits there. So overall, it's a bit of a weird hero class. Most of these perks actually aren't really helping it too much, but it's basically the thing that you bring out for Perpetual Yellowstorm. Triple finesse into this, a couple different pure Strix teams into this, all very, very, very viable. It's just these teams are very niche. It's kind of like, you know, something like Night Spider. Like, it's something you very, very rarely run, but when you do, it's very strong. This is kind of like this hero class. Very rarely are you bringing it out, but if you're bringing it out for a particular purpose, it is because it is like the best option that you have in that particular purpose, and it will end up running that pretty well. So it's mostly used for that Perpetual Yellow team and Strix team, but when it is used, it is very strong in those contexts. Next, we have the Hierophant hero class, which actually benefits quite a bit from the cleanse. It's actually one of the reasons why it's so high. It's one of those other ones similar to Slayer that, given that there's so many triple damage burning hero classes, I slightly underestimated when it first came out. However, it does have an interesting gimmick. The main gimmick that this thing has, as pretty much every hero class has at least one, is it has the only hero class in the entire game that has cleanse on extra turn while having triple damage burning. This is very good if you get entangled or frozen on first slot or anything similar to that, as this essentially just counters it. If you just take an extra turn skull, you don't even need to worry about entangle, freeze, or any kind of other similar mechanic, as you already have the cleanse. So there are some really niche instances where this can actually be your best triple damage burning option, as you have cleanse and your triple damage burning. So that's pretty much all the reason why you bring it out. Has 25% chance to give a random positive status effect to a random ally when its turn begins, so it can give you some random status effects over time. Has some reduction to spells, making it a little bit spell bulky. On top of that, doesn't really have much going for it. Gets a little bit extra HP off its first trait. Gain a bunch of armor in first position can end up being used. However, you're generally using it for its cleanse. However, if you happen to not need it for its cleanse in a given situation, which would be weird because it's generally the reason why you're running this hero class, but if you happen to not need it, you can run with the additional armor. But normally, you're just always running cleanse because it's the whole reason why you'd even bring this hero class out, is for cleanse into triple damage burning. You get a bunch of extra life whenever you take extra turns. Alternatively, if you don't feel like you're going to get that many extra turns, you can go for the extra bit of life recovery. Or if you, for whatever reason, happen to not be running a first slot, maybe it's like a second slot kind of option, you can go for the extra burn. Then you'll likely already have a better burn on the team, so you're probably just going for a life-related option. Normally the one that just gives you stuff on extra turns, as it applies to all 4 of your troops, giving you 8 total life across the team. Next, we go for either Firestorm or Lightstorm. Really depends on the context of your build, though given that a lot of builds similar to Sunspear are really red heavy, a lot of triple damage burning teams are red heavy, so you're generally going to want to go down the Firestorm route. Given for that exact same reason, you tend to go for extra magic on red. However, you can go for one of the bulkier ones, gaining additional life on green, or giving all troops a little bit of armor to go with the extra bit of bulk there. Next, we end up having additional mana depending on what you're looking for. Really depends on the context of your team. Either run extra green, yellow, or red. You're normally running red. However, there are some niche situations where you do run it with different colors depending on your team's context, if you need a +1 for them. And aside from that, you're pretty much always using it with triple damage burning, as there's almost no other reason why you would run it without cleanse into triple damage burning, as that's pretty much the whole reason for using this hero class. So a very niche option, though really good if you need it for that stats effect counter. So next up we have here is the Mechanist hero class. Main thing that comes to mind is Tina 9000 when I think mech. And some of the other mechs that are actually pretty good underneath the category. You may have noticed mech and construct are two different things. I'm pretty sure for most people that's not too confusing these days. However, back in the day, mechs and constructs actually used to be the exact same typing. Though a few years ago, they were actually several years ago, like 4 or 5 years ago, they were changed into two different typings, both into mechs and into constructs. The construct hero class we're getting a couple weeks from now. However, we've had the mech hero class for quite some time now. It gives all mechs 50% mana start, while having immune to freeze naturally, so that's pretty nice. You're generally only using this in context of pure mech teams, so it doesn't really get to do much beyond that. That's pretty much its whole gimmick, is you're using it with very strong mechs. As a giving a random stats effect to a random ally start a battle is pretty much the main one you're going to go for, unless you want a little bit of armor bulk to go with his 20% to skull, which you sometimes run depending on what you want to do. But normally you're going to extra stats effect. Next, you're going for extra damage based on what you're running, either for shield, missile, or tome, depending on what your team is running, or none. Gains barrier at the start of battle. Always good for that little bit extra bulk. It also helps protect its armor if you're going Razor Armor. Next, you either go Razor Armor or Tactician, depending on what your team is. If you want to go more cast heavy, you go Tactician. If you want to end up going like Barrier into the armor thing, you can end up doing a little bit more Skull Pressure. There are better hero classes for doing Skull Pressure, so you don't always run this way. However, it can be good, especially if you're doing like a mass armor buff team into this plus Tina 9000. So you could end up having Hero in first slot, Tina 9000 behind it, some kind of mana accumulator, and one other option. So in that context, if that one other option is like an armor gainer, this could end up being okay. So that you have 20% on skull on your first slot, and then 50% on skull on Tina 9000 in your second slot. So you have that kind of option. Given that this is going all in magic, we have the extra magic to all allies. So you can end up also, if you happen to be not running in first slot, even though it generally is, not always, you can end up burying an ally when an ally dies. So you can help keep whatever is still left alive. Has Banish, which is always good to see. There's not too many strong hero classes that end up using Banish, so any of them that are decent that can, always great to end up bringing out. It's a very niche mechanic, however, it is very strong. Its main gimmick, oddly enough, is for factions. It's probably the strongest location to ever be using Banish. Even though there's not too many stats effects, there is one exceedingly annoying stats effect, and that is Submerge. And generally, most faction teams, unless you're running like Iron Good Zugoff, are going to be hitting all 4 troops simultaneously. So to have a anti-submerge option where you can just take a single extra turn and just deny out all their submerges is really strong if you're using any team that isn't Iron Gut Zugoff or anything kind of similar to that. If you're using like any other context of team, always good to have a Banish in the team. And given that your entire team is probably going to be mechs if you're bothering using this, you can also get all mech allies to have extra armor per turn, which stacks with other things like Razor Armor, Tina 9000's 50% thing, and other things that mechs sometimes have that can end up boost ratioing. Sometimes even Tesla, because it's a Donna troop, so it ends up gaining all that value, even though it itself isn't a mech, though the hero class is. Anyways, next we have ourselves the Shaman hero class. Gosh, I need to remember what all these icons are. Anyway, so as far as Shaman is a bit of a weird hero class. It's mostly used similar to mech in that it's only really used when you're building a pure Taurus teams. First thing that comes to mind with that is Catches a Bull, and kind of doing a big, heavy, like stat-related team with that. But it gives all Taurus allies 50% mana start a battle, so that's always nice. As far as what it can end up doing, ends up gaining some attack here off of its first trait. You sometimes go for the extra web, though normally using this and pretty far up into your team, so much so that you're normally benefiting from the 10 extra armor when using in first slot. Gets that little bit extra bulk too when you constantly take extra turns. This one's actually pretty relevant because you're normally using it with a lot of Tauruses have boost ratio off all their stats. So being able to give them a bunch of life like this is also giving them damage. So out of anything that has Brilliant Aura, this is actually probably the biggest beneficiary of Brilliant's Aura, is almost every single Taurus that you're giving life to is benefiting damage-wise. So not only are you giving them bulk, but you're also giving them damage, which is always great when you can end up doing both simultaneously. You're normally using Green Storm and end up giving a bunch of extra mana accumulation. You can do Yellow Storm, but more often than not, it's going to be Green Storm. Given that you want extra stats on these things, you're normally going for the extra 5 armor, which isn't a lot of extra damage, but every little bit that you can get is pretty useful. If you happen to not have a lot of greens, you can just go for the baseline 4 armor, which obviously 1 less. However, if you don't have that many greens on your team that still need the beneficiary to it, you can do that. However, if you're running something like Double Catches the Bull, they're both green, so you're going to be able to get slightly more value that way. Otherwise, you can go for the more generic trait. That gives 1 less, but it gives it everything. Next, we have the Enrage. This is generally going to be the one that gets used. You can go for a little bit of mana accumulation. However, you're normally using it in first slot, so this allows it to skull pressure a little bit. And on top of all that, it'll end up giving a bunch of attack every single turn to all your Taurus allies, and that will give them even more damage on their cast, as almost all the main Tauruses that you would end up using boost ratio off of every stat they have: HP, armor, attack, and magic. All 4 of them end up incorporating into how much damage they do off their spell. So any extra benefit that you can give them off of attack, off of HP, stuff like that, are all beneficial to their overall damage output. So not the greatest hero class, however, can do some really, really strong things with Tauruses. A lot of these 50% mana start to all of a typing are generally pretty high in the tier list, as you could probably tell. There's almost no bad option that gives 50% mana start to all of a certain type, especially the ones where there's literally no other way to do it. Some of them do have another way to end up applying their 50%. However, any of them that even just have it in general are just always a decently strong option. So next up here, we have Corsair hero class. So Corsair is an interesting one in that it's basically Archmagus, but has one big flaw. It's not Archmagus. But its biggest flaw is it doesn't have a natural half mana start, and has, if not mistaken, no way to actually get half mana start. If I'm not mistaken, rogues do not currently have 50% mana start currently within the game. Do they? I'm pretty sure they don't. I'm trying to think right now. There's so many in the game, but also so many that are missing that I honestly keep forgetting sometimes. But even if it does, that does require you to have to use a whole another there is. Hold up, duh, Rogue Spider team. That's like literally the reason why you end up using it too. Hello, Rogue Spider. Rogue Spider? Rogue Spider. There it is. Yeah, this is like the whole reason this class exists. Honestly, this team alone might almost make it not B tier. It might actually be A tier, just because this team exists. But yeah, Captain McCall, 50% rogue start. Anyways, so as far as Corsair is concerned, its main gimmick is that it gives you a lot of blue. And when I say a lot of blue, I mean a lot of blue. It has +3 into blue. It has +2 blue off of its final trait, while having a trait on its other one right here, which sometimes you don't use, but normally you do, where it gains a additional blue for +3 total. If you happen to be using a first slot on your team, you tend to run it with dodge, though depending on what kind of team you want to use it with, you can run it either or. You're already getting so much blue off of +2 blue that it doesn't necessarily need it, but if you want to go all in, you can go for that +3 blue kind of mechanic. Has Hunter's Mark whenever you take a extra turn. However, you can also run it for extra bulk. So you can run it either way depending on what you want to do for your team. Has a mean for you, so you don't have to worry about that, luckily. Get some extra gold every single turn, which just free resources. You can end up running with Polar Magic or the mana start to yellows, so normally you're running with 20%, and it only takes the highest value, so you can't like stack that 10% into like a 50 or that 10% into a 20. You'll simply take the highest value. So it's generally never ran due to being too low of a percent. Same as the other 15% one. I didn't even really make much mention of it because 10% and 15% is too low compared to just running a 20% metal or, you know, a natural 50% and other things like that. Anyways, next we have, given that you're using so many blues, you're generally running it with extra blue life onto allies. You can occasionally run it with backup just for extra bulk to have backup quite literally. However, you're normally just running with a little bit extra bulk, but both of them do the same purpose of extra bulk. Just one is more luck based. And it might get in your way depending on if you need purple to not be blocked. And generally, if you're doing Rogue Spider team, you need your purple not to be blocked, so you generally don't run with it. You have extra Submerge, so you can get some extra bulk. You have some dodge, or you can go down blue mana. Really depends on what context you're trying to use it in. And finally, and the most importantly, it does count as a rogue, and it does give all rogues additional magic whenever you take an extra turn, which is probably the most strongest thing that ends up getting to do with all the context that it has. But yeah, this one might actually be A tier. I'm not sure why I put it into B earlier. However, I think the main reason I end up ultimately putting into B is there's basically only one team you can ever use it with. Well, there are a few that are kind of like that. They do still have a bit more versatility, However, this one is quite literally like this team and almost nothing else as far as like what is super viable in. The biggest issue with this is rogues do not have a lot of mythics in the current state of the game. If we do start getting more, particularly blue variants of rogues, this could end up going up quite a bit. But the biggest issue in the current state of the game is just the lack of really good mythic rogues. Mother of Darkness was really bad before we got Night Spider, but Night Spider is kind of the main thing that puts it together. Gets a bunch of blue, gets a bunch of purple, gets a bunch of mana accumulations, kind of goes crazy with Rope Dart and everything else. So it's while it's really niche, similar to quite a few things in this tier, when it does get used, it is very devastating. But I guess that's pretty much the summary of B tier, and probably the reason why I ultimately put it here. B tier is a lot of those things that we have here that are basically all options that are used for a really ultra specific team if they're going to be used. Like, they're really good when they're used in that team, but they are like bottlenecked into such a ultra specific team, which does not give them really high build diversity, because this is like one of the only few you're ever using Corsair in. Otherwise you're using Archmagus, because a lot of things are like blue or purple, so you can kind of just use the purple instead and it gets better value. So very situational that it gets up using. Captain McCall is also like a dead slot in a lot of these teams too, because it doesn't do much other than like insta-kill submerge. But anyways, yeah, this whole tier is kind of like the ultra situational, like really specific team kind of build, which is why I ended up ultimately putting in B tier there. I remember now. Anyways, so Archer, because I made this list like 2 months ago. Anyways, as far as Archer is concerned, Archer actually used to be the best hero class before we got perks. 3 summers ago, I believe is when we end up getting it. Was 2 or 3? I'm pretty sure it was 3. Is when we end up getting the 7 additional perks, and by 7 additional perks I mean everything under this area right here. However, prior to those 7, this was actually the strongest hero class in the game. Main reason being is it has a natural 50% mana start into a 50% chance to insta-kill. One really weird caveat to this, and one of the reasons why it's not an A tier, same as Assassin. Well, Assassin doesn't have the same issue necessarily. However, they're both really luck-based. However, one really weird thing about Archer is the way that it calculates this insta-kill, unless they fixed it by now, but I'm pretty sure they haven't, counts as like a infinite damage source in a sense. It does not count as an individual insta-kill. So if you are hitting something that has Skull Reflect, you will die. You will instantly die if they have like any amount of Skull Reflect. It's a bit different than Assassin and a few other insta-kills in the game where, you know, it just kind of ignores everything else that they have. It does not. It just kind of reflects back all your damage, which is a little bit weird. However, the fact that it's at 15% makes it a bit more consistent, which is always nice. But that's pretty much the main reason why you're running it, is 50% mana start and insta-kill. It does have a few other benefits. If you're not getting insta-kill, it helps you secure kills with Hunter's Mark. You get an extra magic for your weapon, normally onto dagger or missile. Actually, oddly enough, I do have 10% mana star here because that's actually the last time I was using it with. However, you're generally going to be using this with Entangle on first slot or gold. Next, we have either Leaf Storm or the Bandit Summon, depending on what you're doing. Generally, this is a bit more of a green-heavy hero class, so you do tend to use it with Green Storm. When you do end up using it, though, it really depends on the context. Though it tends to be in first slot, so very rarely are you even going to be getting the backup value, unless you're using it more or less a second. Next, you can end up going for extra stats depending on what you're running. Generally, you're not running this with Goblins, so you're either running extra 2 attacks onto yellow, or because you're running Green Storm, you're normally running extra armor onto green allies. Given that this is going to be in first slot or second slot, in pretty much every context, you're going to run one with Skull Dodge. And as far as final traits are concerned, even though it doesn't get used as often with rogues, you do generally do it with the Rogue Extra Magic. Even if you only have one rogue on your team, it is still beneficial compared to the other 2 that it gets, as it barely gets any benefit from its other trees there. So it's mostly just used for its insta-kill. So next one we have up on our list is, of course, Assassin, which in some contexts can be considered better than Archer, can be considered worse. Main problem with Assassin is it does not naturally have a half mana start, and it has to deal with being a Naga, which, if I'm not mistaken, definitely does not have a half mana start. Unless I'm missing one again, gosh. However, it runs kind of similarly, but in a different way. The main gimmick that this has is its final trait over here, and the main reason why you would end up bringing it out. This is probably the most RNG heavy hero class. This hero class has 2 options. It's either S+ tier or F tier. Maybe not F, maybe like D or C. But I think it averages overall to B tier, which is why it's in B. It is, it's going to do one of 2 things, either everything or nothing. So it is the most luck-based hero class in the game. That is pretty much its entire gimmick. It has Poison, which is a 50-50 on if it'll do damage or not. It has the main gimmick that it has, which is a 10% chance to assassinate the last enemy when it takes skulls. This is actually somewhat better than archers in some contexts. Main reason being, while archer has a higher chance to insta-kill, which is nice, this will hit a different target than what you're applying damage to. And what I mean by that is, of course, skull always hits first slot. However, the thing that it assassinates or insta-kills is the thing in last slot. So you're applying damage automatically to first, but also having your insta-kill onto last. So you're distributing your damage onto two different things rather than focusing all onto one. While it is still better in some contexts of some teams to be focusing all on the front, this allows you to apply it in a wider range, hitting them both from the front and the back simultaneously. So that's one nice benefit of that. It has Hunter's Mark, so you can apply even more damage to things up front. Ends up having freeze onto a enemy when you end up taking a kill. So once it ends up getting a kill, it can end up doing that. If you get a double kill, if it's 7%, you'll get double freeze as well, which is pretty nice. You get extra gold every single turn, or extra souls, depending on what you want. Otherwise, you can go for a little bit extra summon, but you're normally just doing it for the resources. Gold is the more offensive one in most contexts, so you just go gold. So you can just do whatever you want if you just want the resource. It has an option of 3 different things, depending on the context of your team. Either Ice Storm, Dark Storm, or Extra Bandit. Any 3 of these is viable. It just really depends on what you're running at a given time. You're almost always running with Stealthy. Stealthy is really good. It does have that little bit of lifesteal, but you're pretty much always running in Stealthy, just to make sure it doesn't get targeted directly. It has Skull Dodge, and needs everything it can to end up surviving, and having 30% Skull Dodge in the Stealthy does make it decently tanky, survivable, and it has 7% insta-kill, which is pretty nice, as you can trigger your 10% into 7% into 7%. So you can end up hitting a skull onto first slot that hits your 10% insta-kill to hit last slot, that can trigger your 7% insta-kill to hit another enemy, and you know, kind of keep chaining it from there. So you can end up getting like a pretty solid triple kill that way. Like kill a first slot with skull, kill last slot with 10%, kill the other one off of 2 different 7% rolls that you had. So yeah, you can get a triple kill pretty easily that way. Not easily, but you know, very luck based. It's entirely luck based. Like every single thing's a luck based roll. It almost doesn't have a single thing that is not an RNG based roll. It has like at least 5 or 6 different ones. It has the 7% insta kill, it has 30% skull dodge. It has what else is RNG on this thing? It has some summons that are RNG, but they're normally not using them. It has the poison RNG. It has the skull assassinate RNG. It's a lot of RNG. And the main reason why it's a little bit low is you're basically just rolling the dice. It is literally just like the dice machine hero class, where it might seem insanely good in some battles, and then there will be other battles where it triggers absolutely nothing of value. And it's the main reason it's kind of in B tier. There are a lot of contexts where it can be better, but it's just way too inconsistent to generally be viable compared to other hero classes that are more focused on doing things consistently well, rather than it only occasionally being good. Anyways, next we have Dragonguard hero class. Dragonguard hero class's main gimmick is it is a very bulky triple damage burning. If dragons were ever good again, it would also be used in dragon teams, as you can do it with 50% mana start dragon and kind of have a team built around that. However, has 40% score reduction, which is pretty nice. Also gives all ally dragons a bunch of life and magic every single time it takes extra turn, which of course includes itself, as it does count as a dragon. You can end up getting some extra attack in PvP in order to have a little bit of additional damage there, which is always ends up being nice. You can end up having fireproof, just to make sure that you don't end up getting hit by other enemies' burnings, so you can end up opting for magic instead. It does have barrier on brown to start a battle, or sorry, not barrier on brown, but it has a barrier to start a battle, which can help make it bulky initially. It does not have any way to barrier on brown though, or any way to regain barrier, but it does get to start with it, which combined with its 40% score reduction does make it decently bulky. As with triple damage burnings tend to do, they do tend to run their firestorm in order to kind of get things rolling for those first 4 turns. When an ally dies, it buries another random ally. This is occasionally used. You can sometimes go for its other perks, like if you're using a first slot, which you generally are, you can end up running for the extra stats. Though if you're using it like a little bit further back, you can end up opting for the barrier on ally, or if you think something that isn't your first slot's going to die before it, you can end up running it too. One of its other main gimmicks is a triple damage burning that has Dispel, which isn't as good as having Cleanse like Hierophant. However, it is situationally usable, as it gets rid of things like barrier that might be kind of annoying that you would want to deal with. So you can end up doing things like that depending on the context that you need it in. And aside from that, obviously it's a triple damage burning hero class, so you're pretty much always using it with triple damage burning there. Anyways, next up we have ourselves the Plaguelord hero class. So as far as the Plaguelord hero class is concerned, it is kind of getting outclassed by other classes that keep coming into the game, most notably the one that's coming in a few weeks. However, it's one of those like spell bulky, like barrier on brown hero classes. It's mostly like a really annoying version of it. It gets to do with disease, which is the main gimmick. I think it has like 2 different ways, because it actually has it on the other mechanic as well. It gets to inflict disease on a random enemy on green gem matches. However, it also has disease on over here. It diseases a random enemy whenever it takes an extra turn. So it has 2 different ways to disease, making it actually among one of the easier ways to disease the enemy in the entire game. The problem with that, though, is disease is not good. What disease does, which some people might not even know because it's such a underused mechanic, but it basically halves mana accumulation. So the main gimmick with this is if you were in a context where you could disease the enemy while also having mana drain, you can make sure you mana block the enemy team. Back when using a 6 mana weapon was somewhat popular, one funny thing that you could do is drag the 6 mana weapon to first slot, disease it, and then keep mana draining it, and it blocks the entire enemy's team's mana. This can somewhat be done in the current state of the game by doing it to a mythic, where you drag a mythic to first slot that blocks most of the mana from the opposing team, or all of it depending on how they're built, and then you have it diseased, and then you constantly keep mana draining it. So there is that context, though there are generally better ways of doing that than using Plaguelord. However, Plaguelord is definitely the highest amount of disease in the game, which makes sense given its name. However, you tend to run stun on first slot whenever you take a skull on you, so that tends to be nice. Get some extra bit of life steal into your perk here. You can also go for extra magic if you happen to be using it in the last slot. However, this hero class generally is not used in the last slot. It's pretty flexible in any position. However, last slot is not where it's always located, but it's very rarely used to begin with, so if you happen to, you can end up using it for that little bit extra magic. Has some spell reduction, which is always nice. It's a little bit extra bulk, though you can go for extra disease, though you're normally going for spell bulk instead. But if you really want even more disease, you can end up doing that. Though it already has one, so it's a little bit redundant if you already have a lot of green to be able to trigger his other trait. 50% mana start's always nice to be able to get that your weapon going. Has extra mana into Barrier on Brown. This almost always ran for the Barrier on Brown into the brown mana accumulation. There are some extra there are some contexts where you might want to run the purple mana, or more often not, you're running the extra brown for Barrier on Brown. And of course, as pretty much every single one of these hero classes that have this tree, you're running the immunities. Very rarely are you not, unless you're running a super offensive build that happens to be running otherwise. One other funny thing that this thing can do, if you really want to, though is very niche, is if you don't want to gain barrier when you're taking brown gems, you can actually run it more of a disease skull oriented build, where you have like spell reduction, but you have like a bunch of skull outputs, where you have the Doomstorm to start a battle while going all in on skull disease, which is a very weird way to go about it. However, it is some weird niche thing that the class can do, though normally using as like a spell resistant kind of thing. However, this is decently going to be weaker as we get to new hero classes coming out soon, as it doesn't have the disease mechanic, but it does like the whole spell bulk kind of thing a little bit better. Because the main thing that makes this thing spell bulky is not necessarily the fact that it's 20% spell reduction, because obviously a lot of things in the game do. It's the fact that it gets to make the mana accumulation slower on the enemy while also having 20% spell reduction, because that's the main area where it gets the spell bulk from. Not even necessarily from its 20% mana start, I mean from its 20% spell reduction, but more so from the fact that it has 2 different ways to disease. The one off its trait, though more commonly off of its inflict disease when it takes green. So generally that's going to be the way they end up doing it with. You almost use it always with Truffle if you're going to be using it. However, there are better ways to normally use it with Truffle, like Warden and stuff like that, which oddly enough I do not have in B tier. I have it in top of C. However, Barrier on Browns is so valuable that almost every class with Barrier on Brown is definitely not bad. Though if I'm not mistaken, it is actually the lowest tiered Barrier on Brown hero class, which just goes to show how strong Barrier on Brown is. Because I'm looking over the list right now. Actually, you guys can't see it right now. I'm looking at it on the other computer thing. But if I'm not mistaken, I do not have a single Barrier on Brown lower than Plaguelord. Meaning that the lowest I put anything with Barrier on Brown was... Oh, no, actually, that's not true. I have one other one lower. Runepriest, which we'll get to in a moment. Though, anyways, next we have Necromancer. So Necromancer is actually kind of interesting. Necromancer... Not bad. It's just like everything in B tier, and as we keep going further, just super situational if you're going to bother bringing out. So main gimmick with Necromancer is it's kind of soul heavy. Ends up gaining soul every single time you take an extra turn. Gives a little bit extra magic purple allies there, or actually gains extra magic based on how many purple allies you have. So never mind, that wasn't as relevant, but he gains a bit of souls there. Has souls per turn. So basically this is kind of used in like a soul build kind of thing. It does not have any kind of soul gain initially, which is unfortunate. Would be really strong if it did. They actually mentioned in the past the reason they don't have it on is due to a coding issue with it, so they wouldn't be able to put it on it. However, it still gives you more souls, so if you have other things that raise your cap, can be pretty good with it. Ends up, so basically that's the main reason you use it, is it's a solid hero class that gives you a bunch of souls. When an enemy dies, you generally go for the freeze mechanic as far as its first trait here. Next, you tend to go for the extra... oh, sorry, I'm actually on the wrong one. Its first trait is normally ran with extra bulk onto purple allies, either armor or life, depending on which one you want. Then you go for the freeze, as I just mentioned. Then you generally go for either the 20% spell reduction if you're looking to use this more offensively, or you go for the extra souls as you tend to use it in more of like a soul heavy team. Next, we have the natural 50% mana start, which is always great to have, though it does have option 2 different storms if you want it. However, you're normally running 50% mana start. As with every hero class with stealthy, you're generally running stealthy. It's kind of like barrier on brown. Pretty much anything with barrier on brown always runs barrier on brown. Similarly, anything with stealthy pretty much always runs stealthy. There are very niche instances where that would not be done in relation to these hero classes that have either or. Next, we have purple mana. You can also go with the Death Mark at the start of battle, which is always a fun random one. Death Mark, random enemy at start of battle. However, you're normally going for the extra mana accumulation off of purple, and of course the random is the kill. So overall, its kit isn't bad. It's just other hero classes do what it's trying to do a little bit better. Particularly Thief, I feel like, is one of its main points of contention, where Thief is basically just better Necromancer. It doesn't have all the soul gain, but it has extra utility that just makes it way stronger than what this class could ever hope to do. And it's just one of those classes, like, it's not bad, but it's just outclassed by other stuff. Like the Plaguelord that we just went over too. Like, it's not bad, but other things are better. This thing is not bad, but other things are better, and just tends to not really get used much due to that. But it's still a nice kind of mid-tier hero class that isn't too useless. Next, we're getting into things that are still kind of usable, but we're starting to get into like ultra niche category. This is probably the last tier where you would actually use anything, unless you're building like some kind of weird gimmicky team. Like, this is the very last tier where you're gonna like maybe scrape together the hero class to kind of build something. So let's start with Warden. So Warden actually does have a very particular niche case, and it's literally just that one niche case. The main gimmick of Warden is it is the only hero class in the entire game currently that has both Dispel or Banishment while having Green Storm. You might think this might not have much of a context, so there is one singular team where this is good, and it is Truffle. Particularly Truffle in Underworld. We end up running something like a double Truffle team, you know, like a Mirage Queen, this with double Truffle, or more so Forest Troll with a double Truffle into Hero Weapon. That's the main context that you tend to use this on, as it gives you the Green Storm right at the start of battle, having banished to deal with Submerge. This is not a team that's used too often these days for Underworld, as there are a lot of options these days that kind of do it better. However, it is a option, and a pretty cheap option at that, so it's definitely still usable. However, outside that context, there isn't too many uses for it. Its main gimmick is just Green Storm to banish, and that's pretty much the whole value it has, as most other things on it are pretty bad. Like, you look at its final trait, it's like, how on earth is that even a final trait? All it does is give all allies 5 armor. That is so absurdly bad. It only gets worse as time goes on. I'm not sure why it is so weak. But yeah, it is mostly just used for that Green Storm to banish mechanic. Of course, it has Hunter's Mark, so you can get some skull pressure there. You can get some extra magic for the weapon of choice. Entangle's first slot, which is always nice. It's also really good in the context of its main use case, which is factions, because you're generally going to be able to land that Entangle, and it makes it so those really high damaging factions won't do too much damage to you. Almost always running with Leaf Storm, because it's the whole gimmick that you're even running it for in most contexts. Though it does have 20 damage based on armor if you wanted to do that, 20% based on armor, though very rarely. You're mostly using it for its Green Storm if you're bothering to use that at all. You're going for the extra armor, as there are some other contexts where you could do it with a Heroine build as well, because there's, you can do that, because it's not the only thing. Like, Truffle's not the only thing that you can end up using it for. It's the main thing you normally use it for. But it does have like that Heroine synergy and a few other things like that, where you end up building into like a green ally, you give them a bunch of extra armor off your traits, and then you kind of go into that into banish. Very niche, but it can be used. And aside from that, you can give a bunch of stats depending on what you need. If you have Rogue, if you have a Mech, if you have a War Gear. Generally, it doesn't utilize any of those 3, oddly enough. However, you can just kind of set it if your team happens to be using one in a given situation. Generally, it's going to be War Gear, as it is from a, even though it is a beast typing, it is from a pretty War Gear heavy kingdom. So it's generally the only one that can really get some value from. But yeah, it's a very weird hero class, almost never used, pretty weak overall, but it does still have a usable use case there, with some really niche teams if you need a Green Storm to Dispel. So speaking of Dispel hero classes, next we have Runepriest, which is definitively, unless I missed a different one, the lowest tiered hero class I have for Barrier on Brown. So is Runepriest the worst Barrier on Brown hero class? I'd probably say so. The main reason, I would say, is actually a kind of funny one, and it's mostly because it is a, like, Brown tree is a very dwarf heavy tree, but it's from a dwarf-heavy kingdom. And you would kind of think like, oh, this like double dwarf mechanic would kind of be okay. It's like the weakest way you could possibly use it because you're basically already using it with things that already have the mechanic, and dwarf as a typing just isn't really that good to begin with. So all dwarves end up gaining a bunch of life and attack whenever you take extra turn. It summons a dust storm when an enemy dies. So not only... Oh, never mind. It actually does not have brown at start. That's the other issue with it. Unlike something like Titan that gets brown storm at start while has many of these mechanics, this thing only gets brown storm when you get a kill. So this is good if you're going for a longer battle, but on shorter battles, this is very bad. As you're going to not have your brown storm to start off with when you really need it most. So as far as what this thing does, it is actually basically just weaker Titan in many ways. With a lot less diversity and only really usable in like pure dwarf related teams, whereas even though Titan is good with giants, it can be used in pretty much any build, even with no giants in it other than itself. But anyways, you normally use it with either stun onto enemy or when they take a skull on you, or you end up going for the random stats effect. On the next perk, you basically do it based on what you need your armor into or your weapon into. Then we have barrier on brown to end up giving yourself a bit of bulk. Or why do I keep saying barrier on brown for this? I mean barrier at start of battle. It does have barrier on brown as well, which is one nice combination that has barrier at start of battle while also having barrier every single brown. So it has a little bit of bulkiness that way. You can pressure a little bit of damage while having 20% skull, which stays pretty protected with how much barrier you have. Also ends up having the banishment, which is one of the main reasons why you would rather bring this out, as a barrier brown that has a banishment, which is a pretty decent combination. So alternatively, you can also run enchant on green or extra brown mana, depending on the context. Though generally, if you're using this hero class, you're probably using it with banish. And has fortitude for a bunch of immunities. So it's not a horrible hero class. There's just so many other barriers on browns that it tends to not be that good. Dwarf is a pretty underwhelming typing, and a lot of dwarves already have that immunity trait. Oddly enough, I believe it's actually the same immunities as this. Most dwarves have, which you don't really need more of it. There's also impervious troops that can end up having better overall value than that are under other typings, and dwarves I believe almost entirely don't have it, except for like that one mythic, I think Stonehammer. But most dwarves do not have the impervious traits compared to other typings, so you don't really end up getting much of a benefit because almost all of them have this fortitude one, where they have all those other immunities, but it's not like the full expanse that impervious ends up having. But overall, it's not a bad hero class. It's very niche and pretty much only used with dwarves. However, doesn't really have too much of a value. Also, you need your 50% mana start off of a dwarf. That's kind of okay, whereas you don't naturally have it off yourself like Titan does and a few other hero classes. Anyways, next up we have ourselves the Priest, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, the Priest right over there. So as far as the Priest hero class is concerned, this used to be good back in the day when Divines were solid. However, there was a lot of Divine nerfs. The most noteworthy one is Divine Ishbala, oddly enough. The only 50% mana start troop in the game that does not give 50% mana starts, if that makes any sense. It actually got nerfed down to 40%. I wish they would just turn it back to 50%, because in the current context of the game, Divines having 50% would not be broken. However, back in the day it was, though they should really go revert it back, because it's so weird that that's only at 40%, whereas every other start is at 50%. But anyways, as far as this hero class is concerned, you're mostly using it for like a weird, weaker than Stormcaller class. It's a very yellow heavy kind of Divine build. You're basically only using it if you're running 4 times Divine, with probably the Divine Protector thing, that one green-blue weapon that creates a bunch of mana colors that are really useful for Divines. Like outside that context, you're almost never really using this hero class. That used to be the really big meta that you used to get used with. You use that weapon with like Ubistat, Divine Ishbala, other similar things, and get a lot of value from it. Sometimes even like at Furnace, Ubistat, and stuff like that before almost all of them got nerfed with Divine Ishbala. But anyways, it gives a random stats effect to ally. You can also go for other different bulks depending on what you want. You can end up going for, I don't mind, you can go for extra magic on staff or go for bulk. So you can go for the extra life, but normally going for the random stats effect. But it is a bit more consistent, go for life depending on what you want to do. You can also synergize that with extra armor and first slot if you're using in that context. However, you're normally running it with cleanse just to make sure you can get rid of annoying things like silence and stuff like that, as you generally want to be using your weapon whenever you're using this hero class. Next, you're going to go for a bunch of extra life whenever you take extra turn. This is synergized with one of its final traits, actually, where all Divines get an extra life every single turn, so you get to bulk up a lot of extra life over time, both through extra turns and just turns passing in general. Next, you tend to go for Light Storm, which is pretty much the only reason, the only one you'd really go for, unless you already have a Divine on your team that's doing Light Storm, in which case you're either going for Magic or the Fairy Fire. However, if you don't already have a way to apply Lightstorm due to other divines, you're definitely going to want to go Lightstorm, as any team that this is being used on will be using a lot of yellows. Next, you generally just go for a little bit of magic on all allies. So if you want to go super bulky on top of all your other bulk, you can also go for extra armor and end up going down that route. Gaining some extra life for yourself can also be good, though you're generally not taking too many green. Given how much yellow you're doing, you're generally going to go for extra yellow mana. However, taking extra green mana or enchant on green can also be viable depending on what you want to do with your team. And you're pretty much always running extra life on divines, because almost every time you're using this is almost guaranteed going to be a pure divine team if you're bothered putting this on your team, as the main gimmick of why you're using Priest is to run a weapon that has boost ratio off of divines, so you can have 4 divines on your team while still using hero. That is about the only context that you're doing it pretty much ever going to do it with, and you pretty much just do it for that one divine protector weapon. Let me just go show it real quick if you happen to have it. Yeah, this one right here, divine protector, is pretty much the whole reason why you would run this hero class, like literally the only reason in the current state of the game, as well as in the past. It's a very strong weapon in the context of it. Gains barrier to itself, gives a bunch of like this weapon is the reason why this hero class is not like lower down in this tier list. It is pretty much the entirety of this weapon existing, which is the main reason why it's here. It gives a bunch of extra mana to yellow allies, cleanse itself on top of its other cleanse. So not only does it have cleanse on extra turn, it has cleanse on cast, has barrier on itself, which helps give it tank ability, and it just gets used in a pure divine team. And yeah, that's basically context they use it for. There's a lot of divines that need red and yellow, particularly divine Spala converts the reds to skulls, and obviously almost every divine ends up incorporating yellow in some way, shape, or form. So very, very strong in that context, but it's literally the only context that you would pretty much ever use that. And hey, we got Tribute ready. Anyways, what's next on our list here? So next on, we have ourselves the Tidecaller hero class. So next, Tidecaller. So Tidecaller is basically, do you want Frostmage but weaker but with more Submerge? So you know how Archmagus traded off like casting capability for a little bit of freeze? Well, Tidecaller, and while also still having Submerge if it wants, well, Tidecaller basically gets rid of all viability in order to be able to Submerge. So it's like Frostmage, but you just traded out absolutely everything for Submerge instead. It's just basically a downgrade from it. So like Archmagus, you make the downgrade to Frostmage, and then Frostmage, you make the downgrade to Tidecaller, where they trade off something for something else that the other hero class does, which makes them overall worse, but more specific to that mechanic. So this thing is like absolutely like Submerge heavy. Like everything you're doing based on this is Submerge. So it gets to explode a blue gem when matching 4 more gems, which is actually an interesting mechanic, as quite a few hero classes have this on yellow, but this one has it for blue. It gets to Submerge itself when it takes damage, but it also has Submerge on its other trait. So not only do you get Submerge automatically to yourself when you take damage, but you also get Submerge to your allies. Basically, if you want to have 4 times Submerge, this is generally the class that you're going to go with. However, there are stronger ways to do that, and generally you're basically never going to use this class. However, it does have freeze at start of battle, so it has that going for it. Still has some amount of freeze. Has that cleanse there, so you can end up getting pretty much a decent amount of value from that. Being able to dodge AoE while also being able to dodge status effects in a sense, or most of them anyways, as long as you don't get stunned, as it does not have immune to stun. It does have a natural half mana start, which is always great to see. Has some spell bulk, so you can be 2 ways different bulky 2 spells, not only with 20% reduction, but also with Submerge, so can things like Frostmage. Aside from that, you generally go for Submerge on its next trait, as that's pretty much the main reason you'd even bother bringing it out to begin with. You got 3 different manas depending on the context of your team. You just run with extra blue, green, or purple, depends on what you're running. And it tends to be ran, if you're bothered going to run at all, with pure Merfolk team that have like boost ratio off of Submerge and boost ratio off of blues and Merfolk allies. Ends up giving all Merfolk allies a bunch of magic when an enemy dies. So overall, pretty meh hero class that's basically just a really Submerge heavy thing. But if you're looking for a hero class like this, you're just going to run likely Frostmage with Submerge. And if you're looking for a hero class that's just good, you're at that point you're just looking for like Archmagus or something if you're looking for a caster. But basically Frostmage is just it but better. Just run Frostmage with Submerge and you just have yourself better Tidecaller. Unless you're running a really specific 4 times Merfolk team, similar kind of like the 4 times Divine, you're pretty much never bringing this out. And it's only really usable in those contexts. Anyways, next we have ourselves the Doomsayer hero class, which has one really, really funny gimmick that I almost felt like putting at a higher tier. However, it's not that good of a gimmick, but it is unique only to this hero class. There is no other hero class that comes even close to doing this. Actually, did I say Doomsayer? I mean Deathknight. I still can't find, even though it's in alphabetical order. Where on earth is Deathknight? There it is. So that is the one I had there, right? Deathknight. That is a Deathknight symbol. Yeah, that's a Deathknight symbol. Anyways, so Deathknight. This thing has one main gimmick and one gimmick only. Kill it immediately, which might seem weird for a hero class, as generally hero class with 10 traits is something you don't want to, you know, die. What a rick. Anyways, but yeah, generally the gimmick of a hero is to keep it alive so it supports your team. This hero class is different though. This hero class wants to die immediately and death mark everything. So his main gimmick is he death marks all enemies when he dies. However, there's a very funny mechanic that can allow you to do this immediately. If you do Elspeth onto your hero while it has a pure colored weapon, it will immediately go and create, it will death mark the entire enemy team while man accumulating that weapon. Generally, the way that this gets played is you run it with a purple weapon. You immediately kill it with Elspeth. This will immediately 4 times death mark the opposing team. You then have some kind of summoner and have sacrifice on your team. Sacrifice 1 to boost ratioing off all the death marks on the opposing team and end up giving you a bunch of magic boost. You then keep summoning into the last slot while having something else that applies damage. And you basically just keep gaining magic while applying damage to all enemies while having a summon. It's a very weird gimmicky team that is pretty much almost never viable. However, if you really want to death mark the entire team instantly, you can do that. It's very situational and pretty much only used if you want to mess around with having fun. It's almost not even worthwhile going over its traits, as you pretty much just want to go for traits that trigger at the start of battle in most contexts, but sometimes you're not even going to get any value from it. Like if you're not using Brown, you're not going to get any value from that. But I don't know, it's just a really, really weird hero class. But you do generally just want to set most of these to, unless you're actually using it in a battle context. You mostly want to use it on things that are going to give you some kind of value at the start of battle. So all the things that can actually do something instantly, something helping out your team. Unfortunately, it's not Purple Storm, oddly enough. Pretty much anything. Does barrier actually trigger when you end up taking a death there? I actually do not recall. That's kind of funny if you get a free barrier out of it. But yeah, you basically just want to get any kind of value where you can get value at the start of battle, which that's kind of redundant because you would end up, yeah, you'd probably want to go mana accumulation. Maybe Dispel, really depends. Like if they immediately have something that you might want to get off, like, you know, Bless, you might want to go Dispel. And then, yeah, it's just a really weird class. It is such a weird class. Also, it used to count as a knight. It actually counts as undead now. Back in the day, it used to count as a knight. However, it actually used to be a bit more viable when it counted as a knight, because comparatively to Knight Hero class, it's better than Knight Hero class because Knight Hero class is so bad. However, Knight Hero class is slightly better because Death Knight's not a knight anymore, which surprisingly actually made it slightly stronger. But yeah, this thing's main gimmick is just die immediately to final trait, and that is like the entire context of this troop. It's basically not even a hero class, it's just a thing that applies 4 times death mark to the opposing team. It's a very weird one. However, what is a bit more of a hero class that kind of does the same thing is the next one here, the Doomsayer. So the Doomsayer, kind of the same premise but slower. He has a 25% chance to apply death mark to a random enemy when matching for 4 or more gems, and that's pretty much his main gimmick. He's also the only hero class in the entire game that can explode a gem at the start of battle, particularly a purple one. This is a very niche mechanic that can give you some value at the start of battle. However, it is the only thing that can do it, so I just have that going for it, if nothing else, combined with the death mark, so it's not completely useless, luckily. But yeah, it's basically a slower version of Death Knight. Honestly, I would just say use Death Knight in most contexts if you're going to bother using it, which is why this one's 1 tier down. Well, not 1 tier down, but, you know, 1 step down in the same tier. But anyways, you run it with a little bit of life bulk normally, though you can run it with Scythe depending on what you're running it for. I believe it counts as purple, right? Yeah, it does count as purple, and a lot of Scythes are purple, so you can end up getting extra magic value there. So you can get 7 extra magic instead of just the standard 5. Has Cleanse, so that's not bad. You can also do the chilling thing when an enemy dies. However, Cleanse probably going to be better in some instances. It really just depends. It depends on the context, on the battle. Next we have Disease. Disease, pretty good. Kind of just make sure to get mana slower. This is actually really good in the context of how you're trying to use it, because generally if you're bothering to use this hero class, you're going to want to try to hope you get a death mark kill. And one way that you can try to increase that is making sure the enemy's disease so they can cast at you less, making sure that they won't be able to get as much value as quickly, so you can kind of chip them down. Next, we can go for either Fairy Fire when an ally dies, or Blue Storm, really depends on the context of your team. Next, we have a little bit of Life Siphon, though. If you really wanted to go crazy, you can go for Doomstorm at start of battle and kind of try to pressure down some damage, and then it'll make it easier for your death marks to kill, because there's less things for it to kill if you end up getting a kill or 2 off of the Doom Skulls there. Just have a Life Siphon or some extra life off of green. Really depends on how you want to use it. Normally you go for the extra life for the Doomstorm more often than not. Next we have Death Mark, a random enemy at start of battle. This is one that tends to get ran with it, so you have even more Death Mark on top of the Death Mark that you're already doing. A very Death Mark heavy hero class, except unlike the other one where Deathknight wants to die immediately, this one wants to survive and kind of contribute while using likely a scythe weapon for some AoE damage. And lastly, you can do it with a little bit of unholy extra magic there, and or you can do it all enemies lose some points when you end up taking a skull. However, keep in mind it's only when your hero takes a skull, not anything. And given that this thing isn't particularly bulky, it doesn't really get much value from that, unfortunately. It's also only one stat, so not really doing too much there. Anyways, we're now starting to get to the tier where things are kind of useless. Like, you can theoretically use things in this tier, but anything like D downwards, we're starting to get to things where, under most contexts, you're probably not running it, but at least they're not like the worst things in the game, but you're probably not running them. Anyway, speaking of something that you're probably not running, but probably have ran in the past, is the first hero class most people will ever get. While it's technically not the mandatory first hero class you'll ever get, realistically it will be, as it is the very first kingdom, which means this will likely be your very first hero class. Make sure not to level it, or not level it, but you know, like, don't use it, like, go get a better one. Like almost any other hero class, like, randomly pick one, you will find a better one. But yeah, it's among one of the worst hero classes in the game. Not the absolute worst, we still have an F tier. However, one of the main reasons this thing isn't an F tier is, for one, it's triple damage burning, and you can't put a triple damage burning in F tier. Actually, let me double check. Did I? Actually, I did. Though there's a reason why. It has a trait that makes it so bad that almost makes it like negative tiered. But yeah, triple damage burning is okay. It's just the problem with this is every other triple damage burning except for one is better than it. And in the context of when you're using it, you're generally not really going to be at the point where you can get to triple damage burning, because when you're using Warlord, you're generally using this as early on in the game. Like, you know, you like just started the game, you just unlocked your very first hero class, you set it as your first hero class. And as your first hero class, it's actually not that bad, because generally early game meta tends to be pretty skull heavy. And this thing gives you a lot of skull benefits. Gains 3 attack whenever dealing skull damage. So every single skull you take, you get even more damage. Ends up gaining 1 attack whenever it takes damage, which all these are pretty low values, but you know, earlier on in the game those are quite a bit more. It gets some extra attack at start of its battle. You can even do even more if you're in PvP, or go for the more generic one that works everywhere. And when you're going through quest lines early on in the game, you're getting so much extra attack that, you know, this thing's actually kind of good at pressuring some damage. You gain even more attack when you take damage, which is actually 3 attack total then, whenever you end up taking damage. 1 off of Frenzy, 2 off its basically Super Frenzy. Then you can end up going for either burning when an enemy dies, or axe extra damage, or generally the 2 that you're generally going to be going for here, depending on if you're using an axe or not using an axe. Then, as or many teams are like this, you tend to just run Red Storm, as pretty much most teams are built around this, do want to have that Red Storm then. On top of the billion ways that it has to gain attack, you can also gain 3 attack whenever an enemy dies. Otherwise, you tend to either run 2 to all stats, as this thing will generally be used in first slot in most situations, as you're going and progressing through the game, your hero is actually the bulkiest thing you have on your team. So there are some situations where you do that and have even more bulk. It's more consistent than this, but as the battle goes on, you'll get more value from having Vengeance, so it really depends on how you want to run it. Obviously, you're generally going to want to go in Rage if you're going to run with this thing. This gives you even more damage and allows you to hit through traits. And of course, it's triple damage burning hero class, so obviously you're going to run triple damage burning, as it is one of those few really good perks on the final one that gives you a lot of value compared to the other 2 that you would basically never use. Yeah. So overall, it's not horrible. Like, when you get it, it's okay. Like, for the first, like, few levels, and you're just kind of using it just as your hero class, like, it's fine. It has a lot of additional ways to gain a little bit of attack, but it's definitely a hero class that you retire pretty early once you realize how bad it is. But, I don't know, it's good for starting out in the game, and for when you get it, it's not bad. So it's definitely not the worst hero class out there, that's for sure. Anyways, next up on our list, we end up having the Bard hero class. Bard's a bit of a weird one, where... Actually, Oracle's more so like the one where it's like, why on earth does this even exist? However, I don't know, Bard's close to that. The main gimmick that it has is, does have immune to silence, but it gives all yellow allies 1 to all stats. This, as the game goes on, is increasingly worse. Like, on paper, like, that's not bad, but over time, that just keeps getting worse and worse and worse as more and more stats come into the game. It doesn't really excel at anything. It's just such an average hero class in every single way. Like, theoretically, it could actually be slightly stronger to some of the ones we have above it, as it does have like a natural 50% mana start, which that alone is kind of okay and stuff like that. But it just is outclassed in every single way. Like, there's no reason, unless you're building like a really weird pure wild folk team where you just really want to have it for that boost ratio. Like, in that context, it could be okay, as there are some things in this kingdom that aren't like completely abysmal. But outside that context, like, when are you ever bringing this out? It's just very average in every way. As far as what it can end up doing. It gives a random stats effect to an ally generally, though sometimes you run with skull damage, so almost always you're running with random stats effects. You can end up having additional magic depending on what you're doing, jewelry, tome, or last slot. This thing can be pretty viable in last slot, so it can be used that way. Has 20% spell reduction, which can make it a little bit spell bulky. Has a natural 50% mana start, though a lot of context of teams that it's used with is pure wild folk. And normally you're already using a troop that has that 50% mana start for your entire team. Because if you're bothering to use this, you're using it with pure wild folk, so you don't want just 50% mana start for yourself, you want it for your entire team. So normally you're running like the extra magic. I just have it as 10% extra XP because, oddly enough, there isn't really a good 10% extra XP hero class. That could change into the future, but as it currently stands, none of them really do that particularly well off of morale tree. You might notice like most things that have morale are actually kind of low down on this list. However, yeah, it's kind of unfortunate because we could be getting some extra XP. It's not a lot, but hey, it adds up over time. But yeah, normally, oddly enough, despite it having 50% mana start, you're normally not using it due to King Salinas. Because if you're bothering to use this, you're using it with pure wild folk, so it gets the value that way. So normally you're running with magic or that. Anyways, you get extra magic off its trait there for a little bit extra magic to your allies to synergize with everything else that you have. You're generally running with either, because you're already going to have 50% mana start, you're normally running with either purple mana or enchant on green, depending on the context of your team. Normally enchant on green because of Wild Queen. I'm going to be spamming a lot of green, so you're basically going to perpetually have enchant there. And all three of these bonuses are basically completely useless to it, so you're generally going for that little bit of extra magic on mystics. But yeah, it's an okay hero class. In theory, you could even consider almost up to C. And depending on, like, if you really want to build it into a weird wild folk team where you're mana accumulating, it's almost like the category of priest. So maybe it was a little bit more justified in C, even though we put in like high B, but it's somewhere in like that almost useless, very situational category, where unless you're building a pure wild folk team, you're pretty much never bringing this out. And similar priest, unless you're building a pure divine team. A lot of hero classes tend to be under that category, where unless you're building like a pure team under that, like even knight can be considered under that, which I guess is okay to put that in C then. I mean in D tier then. Because Knight's another one of those that's we're about to get to in this tier, where like it's okay in a pure Knight team, but like when else are we using it other than that? It's basically under that category, where yes, Bard is usable in pure Wild Folk, but it's basically never ever even getting touched remotely otherwise. Anyways, next we have ourselves the Dervish hero class. I believe it's Dervish. No, that's not Dervish. What's that one called? I know where it's located, or maybe I don't know where it's located. Wait, was it Dervish? And I'm just forgetting. Yeah, it is Dervish. Never mind, I was right the first time. Anyway, so Dervish hero class. So, main gimmick of this is very dodgy. It is the dodgiest hero class in the entire game. It has 30% dodge into 20% dodge, which gives it a 40-something, I think, or high 30-something. I think it's high 30-something, like a 37-something, 38-something% chance. Because they don't add together, they trigger independently. But yeah, it's like a high 30-something chance, if I'm not mistaken, which gives it the highest dodge chance of any hero class in the game, basically slightly over 1/3, which is not bad if you wanted to really have a skull dodge capability on your hero. However, that's like the only thing it really gets to do properly. It has like a little bit of monster synergy, but you're generally not going to be able to do much in a pure monster team, as pure monster teams aren't really that good. Has a Hunter's Mark, which kind of can combine decently with skulls, because you can kind of do it in like a skull spam heavy team, where you have really high dodge to dodge the entire thing, and then you have the Hunter's Mark pressure, but then if you get unlucky, you kind of just lose. It gets a multiple array of different extra magic for its next perk. Next one, you tend to just go for a little bit extra gold, or you can go for extra magic on yellow allies. Then you end up having the Brownstorm or Bandit Summon, depending on what context you're doing it on, normally Brownstorm. Next, you end up going for generally the extra bit attack on yellow allies. However, if you happen to have a few giants on your team, which generally you wouldn't, but you can go for the life magic as this a little bit of a better stat. You're almost always running this with dodge as the main gimmick of why you would even bother putting this team in any reason, shape, or form, is to have the highest dodge of any hero class in the game. And finally, in combination with the fact that you might end up doing it into Giants here, you can end up doing it into Elemental for the extra synergy as well. There are some situations where you might put into Rogue as well for the extra magic there. Really depends on if you're running Rogues or Elementals on your team, on which one you would end up setting of the two. But overall, it's basically a super gimmicky dodge hero class that is just outclassed by things that are more consistent at protecting themselves. Normally score reduction and barrier on brown are way better ways to consistently stay alive than being able to have a really high dodge, and it's not high enough to really justify using it. Like if it was like something like a 60-70% overall dodge, like I could see this being pretty viable. Like if its trait was like a 50% one and you know it had like the extra 20% or 30% off of its trait, like in that context, if it had 50% there and then 30% off the normal trait, like in that context, then yes, it would be really viable, because then that brings it to like what, a 60-something% dodge chance. It'd be closer to a 2/3 instead of a 1/3 or so dodge chance, which would make it extremely viable. However, that's not what it does, and the fact that you could just stun it and then it has no dodge at all, it's just a really weird hero class that in almost no context really has a usable case. Next one, we have a hero class that I actually completely forgot which one that is. What icon is that? Let's see. Let's play Find the Icon. This one is actually so underused, I completely forgot which one this is right now. I think this was the one I was thinking of earlier. Yeah, that was the one I was confusing for a second, because they're both from like a really desert-heavy kingdom. The other one's from Drifting Sands, this one's from Leonis Empire, which are the two desert kingdoms, and sometimes I confuse the two desert kingdoms, which is why I was confused there for a second with Dervish, and why I was scrolling all the way to the right there to try to get to this one. But yeah, they're the two desert ones. But anyways, this one's like a weird stun hero class, has some score reduction, has 50% chance to stun a random enemy when the turn, at the start of its turn. And at one point was the only way that you could stun a enemy off of a additional perk off a hero class. However, now Elementalist does this to such a degree that this hero class is so laughable, because you have the capability of stunning, entangling, freezing, and what was the other mechanic? Burn? Why do I forget? But you have the 4 stats effects off of Elementalist compared to off per extra turn, whereas this is just a 50% chance to stun a single enemy when its turn begins, which not only is that turn begins a weaker mechanic than on extra turn, but it's also a % chance rather than guaranteed, which compared to Elementalist is just the most laughable thing ever. As far as this hero class, yeah, there's like almost no context you run it. Even in the context of its own kingdom, there's not really a proper way to run it with pure human. Like if you're running pure human, you're just running double Tesla into the 50% mana start troop, in which case I guess you could use the hero in that context, but generally you're running other things, but I don't know. It's just really bad. You generally run it with a little bit of attack here, either 5 or 4, depending on the context of where you're running it. You're generally, if you're going to be running this thing, it's generally going to be a first slot, so you can run extra bulk there, with a bit of armor there. You get a bunch of extra life off of the extra turns you can end up getting. Next, you can end up going Lightstorm or extra 10% XP. Really depends on the context you want to run it on. Obviously, Lightstorm is stronger. However, it also has the Glory thing, so you can run it for resources if you want to. I haven't really mentioned the Glory one. It's very situational. There's so much better ways to get Glory in like thousands at a time, like, you know, Glory Gnomes. So 1 extra Glory per fight is kind of a pretty dated mechanic. But at least 10% extra XP on the ones that do have it is a little bit more relevant, because you constantly always need more XP, whereas you don't necessarily need more Glory. Then we have extra stats because you're generally using a first slot, which synergizes with the other first slot trait that it has. So it gains 12 to all, or 12 to armor, 2 to all other stats when used in first slot in that combination, which isn't a lot, but hey, it helps. You can either run in Rage or extra to yellow, depending on the context of your team, and you generally run it with Divine for the extra little bit of life every single turn, as the other two are pretty much useless in any team that are ever be used on. Similar to the entirety of the hero class itself, pretty useless. Anyways, next we have Knight hero class. The only reason this thing is not an F tier is Deathknight is not a Knight anymore, even though it literally is called Deathknight. So now the Knight hero class is the only Knight hero class in the game currently, which is the only reason why it has any viability at all, is because it is the only Knight. As far as its perks here is basically pointless. It gains 2 armor every single turn, which might seem like something that's actually valuable. However, this is actually pretty bad, because one of the other troops that it will end up being used with gives 2 armor to all humans per turn, and this thing counts as a Knight, not as a human. So it's basically just getting back to trait that you would already be having for using it in that context. And yeah, it's just pretty bad. You're normally going to be using it for the extra 5 attack in PvP, extra armor at first position. Going to be using it likely with a bit of life, though you can also do the barrier starter battle, depends on what context you want to use it in. You have that Razor armor, so you can do that little bit of skull poke there. Knights tend to get a lot of extra armor at the start of battle as well, since you're most likely only using this in a pure Knight context team, and a pure Knight team is going to be gaining dozens of extra armor, so that's a little bit extra damage pressure that you can end up getting, kind of like mechs when you're using a lot of mechs in a team. Knights also gain a lot of armor, particularly Sword's Edge, I believe, is almost like a pure armor gain kingdom, so yeah, a little bit of damage there, though it's pretty redundant. It's not that high, though earlier on in the game it might be a little bit more valuable, though it's a pretty bad hero class overall. Extra stats when used in first slot is it tends to get used in first slot. But you can also get barrier. If you use it further back, you can use the barrier to other allies. Has banish, which is probably the most useful thing that it has, like in a pure Knight team, because you will be able to hit extra turns off your Knight weapon because you're getting a bunch of mana accumulation off it. So you can kind of get some value there in any kind of Knights that might need Submerge. To get rid of Submerge with the spell and stuff like that. And aside from that, there are quite a bit of Knights that do have Divine Overlap, so you can get a little bit extra life for them. As the other two basically do nothing for the hero class. Anyways, we're now going into F tier, basically the things that in pretty much no context would you ever use. The only one context I would say maybe is if you're actually using it in a 4 times of the typing, like for example Oracle into 4 times Centaur kind of thing. Even then though, they're just so bad that you're generally just not going to do it. So this first one honestly might almost deserve being the absolute last. The only reason it's not the absolute last of F tier is it's triple damage burning, but it's this Diabolist one here. So the main thing keeping it from being the absolute worst hero class in the game is it has triple damage burning. However, this is literally a negative perk. I have no clue why they gave it to this at all. It has a 25% chance to summon a Nightmare, which is just a pure yellow troop that does almost nothing, when an ally casts a spell. This is basically a negative perk because the Nightmare is such an absurdly bad troop that you're basically just bloating up your team with something that's completely useless. It is so absurdly bad compared to all the other things that have a summon. Every single summon that all the other ones have had actually been usable and have some kind of synergy. And while they're not the greatest of troops in most situations, they're at least like they're not a nightmare. But yeah, this like actively gets in the way of what the hero class normally wants to do. And in many contexts, you're not even going to trigger it. And in contexts that you do, you don't want it triggering. So it's just a really bad all-around perk that actively makes the troop worse, not better. It's just so bad. Anyways, main thing keeping it from being the absolute worst class in the game, it is triple damage burning. And that's literally the only thing keeping it viable. However, there are a billion other triple damage burning options in the game that do every possible other function you would ever want. The only really funny thing that this class does have, though, is Doomstorm start into triple damage burning. While you would normally run it with Firestorm, actually is kind of funny. Doing it in this order actually would make it so it does Doomstorm. However, gosh, it has even more use to summon. I just realized. This might actually be a perk where you want to have none. The reason why I have Firestorm set here, it's actually kind of funny because it goes in descending order. So it's actually going to trigger a Firestorm, then trigger a Doomstorm, which means it's only going to trigger a Doomstorm. So if you have Ice Storm or Firestorm triggered while also having Doomstorm triggered, it'll only just trigger the Doomstorm there. So you don't have to worry about that. But this is like an actively bad trade as well, that one. It's one of those other few summons that's actually kind of bad to end up doing. Basically everything this has that has a summon are all like the worst summons you would ever want to have on your team. But yeah, it has like, I don't know, it's just a triple damage burning that aside from like Doomstorm into triple damage, which normally you want Firestorm, that's like the only thing it has to the table, and that's about it. It gives all daemons an additional attack, which when I was mistaken counts as a daemon itself, so it's additional attack for itself, as well as any allies that happen to be under that category. Get some freeze when enemy dies, though sometimes you run it with a little bit extra purple steel. You could even run it with a mean of burning if you really need it in the context. A little bit extra souls, so you can run it for disease if you want the higher value, as far as like, you know, winning a battle. Every single one of these three is completely redundant, as either the two storms is completely pointless if you're running Doomstorm, which generally you are, unless you're running the Lifesteal, in which case you want to run Firestorm into the Lifesteal there. But normally you're running with Doomstorm if you're bothered using this in any context at all, as that's the main gimmick that you'd pretty much want to use for this thing. You want extra red mana unless you want to gamble a random death mark at the start of battle just for pure chaos, because why not? And obviously if you're running this class, you're running triple damage burning. And yeah, it's just outclassed by other triple damage burnings. If you really want a Doomstorm at start of battle, there are other better ways to have a Skull Storm or Doomstorm or even Uber. Yeah, is there Uber Doomskull? I can't remember. What's her name? Yeah, what's her name creates Uber Doomstorm? Yvandra. So yeah, there's so many other ways that you could just have a Skull related storm that isn't using this hero class while still having a triple damage burning. So there really isn't any reason to end up bringing this out. So for that reason, it's just really bad. Next we have ourselves, I actually forget what hero class that is. That's actually such an underused one. What is that one again? Gosh, that's like the second or third. I think it's the second one we somewhat forgot. It is not Shaman. It is something. Does it exist? Is it even a hero class that exists? Am I trolling myself? It's Barbarian. Anyways, so as far as Barbarian, oh wait, there actually is another. Oh no, never mind. You're not triple damage burning. I thought that was for a second. I was like, wait, no, you're not. But yeah, this cleric class is. I don't really understand. Oh yeah, I remember what this hero class is. You know how Groshnok is the home of every worst mythic in the game? They wanted to keep up that tradition while also making the hero class just as bad. I'm not sure why they have a vendetta against Groshnok. I don't even think that's the next kingdom we're getting kingdom rework to. I think it's Broken Spire. However, gosh, is there any location that needs a rework? It is probably Groshnok. I'm not sure why they just hate Groshnok so much, but they just love putting every worst thing in Groshnok for some reason. I do not understand why. It has some skull dodge. Gains 3 attack when matching red gems. So it does get to like slowly build up its attack. Also gains some attack when it takes damage, which even more than the other trait that gained 1 or 2. It actually gains 3. So it gets to build up a little bit of attack there. Technically gets to gain 5 because it does stack with this one. Normally ran with a little bit extra attack because obviously if you're running this, you want a lot of attack there. Kind of build that up. Though it doesn't really have any mechanic to try to use that attack for more damage. So it does gain rage. So I guess technically it does have one way to end up doing that to a little bit more. But yeah, first perk, attack. Next perk, more attack. Next, you'd likely run with Entangle unless you really want to go for a little bit of magic, but normally you'd want to go for the Entangle to make sure you're safe from your own skulls, as you're almost running it always with skulls. Green Storm or Brown Storm depends on the context of your team. Next also depends on your team, but you're normally going for armor, unless you want even more attack when the enemy dies. Why not? All in attack. You're likely going to want to go either in Rage or Mana Accumulation, depending on the context you're using on. And Rage is a more offensive build, whereas the other one's a bit more Mana Accumulating heavy. And next you would end up going for extra magic on elementals, as the other two are pretty much never going to be used, as you're almost always going to be using a pure orc team, which means even that one's probably not going to get used, but at least it's a more beneficial one if you are using it to any capacity. But yeah, it's just a really, really bad hero class, even worse than Warlord, Warlock, I mean, that you get from the, yeah, Warlord, I was right the first time, that you get from the starting kingdom. It's just not really a class you would ever bother using in any context. It's not worthwhile using 4 times orcs. Orcs are already so bad. And yeah, just hero class you're never going to use. Anyways, next on our list, we have ourselves probably the weirdest class in the game, even though it's not the absolute lowest one. So Sorcerer class. First thing you think, this hero class is good at casting. So what you'd think, this hero class, it's a sorcerer. So you would think it has, you know, like 75% mana start because no other hero class does, or, you know, at least 50% mana cast. Like, it's a casting hero class. Obviously it has 50% mana start, right? No. It does. Oh, apparently I copied someone else's team that had this at one point because we have a bunch of empty ones. But yeah, it does not have 50% mana start. At least not naturally anyways. Which is at all. Yeah, Daemons don't have mana start yet. It literally has, it's a caster. It's a caster that has no 50% mana start naturally, nor off of troops, because currently there's no Daemon that gives 50%. Oh gosh, that's hilarious. One other thing that's extremely dated is this was one of the ones added in, you know, like the first chain of all the hero classes, and this is so absurdly dated. 50% chance to gain 1 magic every turn. Even if this was 1 magic every single turn, this is outclassed by like Oracle and things that gain it to itself and everything else that's yellow per turn. It's just so bad. Aside from that, it does have a purple link, but compared to Archmages, it has +2 into purple, or potentially +3. It's just not really that much mana. Plus, if I'm not mistaken, it can even get +2, because it doesn't even have a tree to give it the extra purple. So not only does it only have +1, it doesn't even have a way to get +2. Because at least Priest has +1 in the yellow, but it also has another way to get to +2. I'm not sure if I really mentioned that when I mentioned Priest, but it's actually I believe the only +2 hero class. Some can go to +3, but Oracle, not Oracle, I mean Corsair and Archmages can reach +3. Priest can reach +2. But you'd think this would be another one that could reach +2 because, you know, it has a link off its thing, but it doesn't have a tree that ends up giving the purple. Which it would have had the 50% mana start tree. It just doesn't make any sense. Anyways, it's a really bad hero class that in theory should be a good caster, but is like the worst caster in the entire game. Well, not the absolute worst, but It's just missing all the things it needs to be viable. So here you're normally running with random stats effect or into extra life to purples. Next you're running either Tome, extra magic, or Steal and life whenever you take purple. As far as the next perk, you're normally running either one of its summons or disease to disable out the enemy. Next, you're probably running Purple Storm to synergize with your 1 extra purple, otherwise you're getting extra 3 magic to start a battle, depends on the context of what you want to run. Then you're running Stealthy, unless you really want to mess with Doomstorm, but you're probably running Stealthy. Next, you'll likely want Enchant on green, as neither of the other 2 actually mana accumulate at all, which is kind of weird. Gain 2 magic when attack and take damage. Oh yeah, never mind. Well, unless you can get poisoned. It's actually a really funny one if you actually could get it on you. But gain magic and attack when you take damage to the life. Interesting. I'm actually surprised. Did, wait, does Orc Hero class actually not get that? Wait, does Orc not get that? Because that's actually a weird one for Orc to not get. Did I not notice that when I went over that? Why does Orc not have that perk? That's weird. That would actually be kind of interesting if Barbarian had that. Because, wait, what one are we on right now? We're on, Sorcerer. But yeah, that's actually, I'm not sure I just noticed that now. But yeah, that would actually be an interesting trait to Orc to have, because then you'd end up getting 5 attack plus 2 magic per poison proc or bleed proc. However, yeah, he doesn't have that tree. But anyways, you normally run it with enchant so you can get some mana accumulation, and you run it with the assassinate thing so you can get some insta kill there. Overall, you'd probably want to use any other hero class that has this. But yeah, it's just it's basically trying to be a casting hero class that is not properly a casting hero class. If you want this class, you're using Archmagus or Thief or something similar. It's basically just a way absurdly weaker version of Archmagus or Thief. It also has a repeat typing, if not mistaken, is Daemon. There's already like 2 other hero classes that also count as Daemon, so it's already fighting in a category that has a lot. And the one that we have as the absolute worst, which honestly, I'm not sure if it's the absolute worst. I just hate the synergies that it has to such a degree where it's like, yeah, it's just gonna go there. But that is the Oracle hero class. So Oracle, Centaurs in general, which is of course the Centaur hero class, it doesn't really have too much use. All Centaurs gain a bunch of magic when an enemy casts a spell, so it has that going for it. Ends up gaining some life when an ally casts a spell, so that's barely going to do anything. Ends up giving some Centaur a little bit extra life off its thing. Like, obviously, it's meant to be used with Centaurs, but it just doesn't cover anything. Like, it doesn't really do anything that a Centaur team would actually want it to do, other than it's counting as a hero class where you can use a weapon that also just counts as Centaur, but, you know, every other hero class can also do that. But, I don't know, just not really providing much to your team. It gets a random stats effect, or you can go for a little bit of bulk. Ends up gaining even more bulk if you use it in first slot. Otherwise, you could do it with extra magic into a specific weapon. It gives a bunch of life to your allies. So Centaurs and stuff don't really benefit from having the stats. Either Lightstorm or giving a bunch of magic at start. I guess technically you give Centaurs a bunch of magic if you're running 4x Centaur, which realistically, if you're using this class, is probably the only context you're ever doing, though sometimes it's better just to put it on hero instead. Giving a bunch of armor to allies or a bunch of life to or magic to allies. Tends to be the 2 you tend to go for, depending on what you're trying to do with your team. You can either go for yellow mana there, or go for the enchant on the whenever you take a green, depends on the context of your team, and a little bit of life whenever you take extra turn, every single turn that goes by, to kind of round it all off with. But yeah, it just doesn't really serve much of a purpose. Obviously 4x Centaur can theoretically be used with, but all these hero classes can theoretically be used with 4x of its typing, especially if they're the only of the typing, like this one, you know, the only Centaur. Similar to Knight hero class, it's the only Knight, so it can kind of be used in that context. So at least with 4x Knight, you at least get better synergies, whereas the synergies with this thing, pretty bad. But anyways, let me go bring up the final list then. So that is the final verdict of our tier list for every single hero class currently within the game, as well as one that currently is not in the game that will be in like 2 weeks from now. The Geomancer, that's 2 Fridays from now, or sorry, 3 Fridays from now actually. Two, never mind, it should be 2. Well, some amount of Fridays later this month. I think it's like the 21st, whatever it was. Actually, I can bring it up right here. It was, actually, let me close that out. It was supposedly 22nd, unless it gets delayed. So there's that. Anyways, so yeah, it's 2 weeks. But anyways, that's the rundown on the tier list. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to leave it in the comment section below. It probably won't be up immediately when I post this because I'm probably going to bed. However, at some point later, if you're watching this at a later point, I will try to put timestamps. And if I haven't yet, definitely like put a comment saying, hey, go put timestamps. Because I do want to put timestamps to make it a little bit easier to find every single one of the hero classes. That probably won't go up when you're initially watching this if you're watching it like the day of. However, I do want to go put that in so it'll be a little bit easier to navigate. Yeah, if you just want to find like a specific class, like let's say Geomancer, if you want to go look it up in 2 weeks once that hero class comes out, or you know, maybe you want to see how Assassin's doing. Just to kind of look up each individual one. So I will have the like kind of dividers. I didn't actually do that for like most videos, but I definitely should for this one, as the time is now almost 2 hours. So we'll make it a little bit easier to get through. I had a feeling it'd be that way. Obviously, there's 36 hero classes, so if we spent even just a few minutes per, we're already up to over an hour and a half. So that's pretty much what we did. We spent about like 3-4 minutes per hero class, and that ended up being a 2-hour video, which is how long we kind of expected this to take. But anyways, guys, definitely feel free to leave a like on this video. It means a lot, especially for how long it takes compared to a normal one, especially how much build up and prepping and everything. And I had to go get all these files as well. Also, thanks to Terran's World, as always, for actually accumulating all these files. Otherwise, it would have been even more of a headache to do so. I think there's a few other places that kind of keep track of it too, like Gems of War database and stuff that I did specifically get off of Terran's World, as per usual. So thanks a ton for that, as that definitely made it a lot easier to make this list as well. But yeah, definitely feel free to leave a like on it. Helps out a lot. And if you have any tier list suggestions, feel free to leave them below. I would be greatly appreciated. I do definitely want to get back into doing tier lists. It just takes a little while to accumulate all the files, prep it, kind of practice it a little bit so we don't fumble too many times. We kind of did slightly this, but I don't know. I don't think we did too bad on it. But anyways, guys, we'll catch you later. Definitely feel free to mention any other things you want me to cover, and we'll do more in the future like this. Obviously, I know one of the big ones that people want me to cover, because it is, even my trailer is my channel right now. They need to fix it. Is the 2020, the last when we did it, the Mythic tier list, and we got some pretty good ones since then. Obviously, we've gotten things like most recently like Wild King, but most importantly like Ironhawk. It wasn't even in the previous video, so got some pretty heavy hitters since then. But anyways, guys, I'll catch you guys later. I hope you all have a wonderful week. Don't forget, there is an Elementalist hero class if you're watching this the day of this video going up, so definitely make sure to go get EXP towards it, as is definitively S tier. Could even be S plus tier if we made a tier above it, as is that strong. Anyways, guys, we'll catch you guys later. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks for watching.